Chapter 164, Teaching a Lesson, 1. This chapter has been stolen from LoveLore novels. Please read from the original source. Right after witnessing that scene, Kai's eyes turned bloodshot from anger. He was truly shocked. This young madam had remained calm and silent from the moment she had entered, and she had seemed to have a mild temperament. When they entered, she had let her glib-tongued servant speak. Furthermore, she seemed pretty young to boot. Kai had subconsciously assumed that she was weak and easy to bully. He completely hadn't expected her to sweep all the dishes onto the floor when angered. This young madam had even said that their food was the food of pigs. However, before she and her entourage arrived, these dishes were originally meant to be consumed by none other than his family. His eldest aunt had simply served the food already being cooked. So, didn't this mean she was calling them all pigs? Kai's face flushed with anger. He always had an explosive temper. Ever since his uncle made use of his connections to give him a job at Gillen Restaurant, Kai had never faced any setbacks. How could he endure this terrible insult? He was shocked speechless for a moment before his anger took over. Kai's face warped, and he found the voice to shout, "Ha! Who the hell do you think you are, creating trouble at our Gillen restaurant? Why don't you ask around and find out just who this Gillen restaurant belongs to? Let me tell you, if you don't want this matter to blow up, pay up and get out." The commotion in the main hall had finally managed to alert Mrs. Wang, who was all the way in the backyard. She hurriedly rushed out. When she saw the mess on the floor, her eyes widened in shock as well. She stuttered, What's going on?" Kai turned to tell her, this arrogant madam was the one who tossed them to the floor. What? Chu Lian calmly glanced at Kai. She couldn't care less about their conversation. She dusted off her hands and stood up. What if I don't want to pay up and refuse to leave? What can you do to me? Kai hadn't expected Chu Lian to be so forceful. However, with House Jing'an backing them, she had to think again if she thought they were going to be easy to bully. Thus, he started getting aggressive too. What can we do? I'll let you have a taste of what jail is like. Wenqing and Wenlan stood in front of Chu Lian with angry expressions, shielding her. Their bodies were tense. The moment Chu Lian gave the order, they would immediately take this boastful fellow down. Chu Lian sneered. So this trip wasn't a complete waste. She had seen clearly for herself what the state of affairs were like at Gillen Restaurant, so she didn't have to continue acting out this farce with these two servants. Chu Lian sent a commanding look towards the manservants behind her. Before Kai and Mrs. Wang could throw up another fuss, the two of them were caught and tied up by the two burly manservants. In a rage, Mrs. Wang cried out, "How dare you tie us up? We're servants from House Jing'an. You can't tie us up." Chu Lian walked a circle around the two of them, then another for good measure. "House Jing'an. I'm apprehending some bad servants on behalf of House Jing'an. You! How dare you? Aren't you scared that House Jing'an will hold you accountable for your crimes and punish you?" Kai struggled and wriggled against his bonds. His eyes were now completely bloodshot from anger. However, since he was just a teenager, he couldn't possibly beat the manservants who practiced martial arts. His struggles bore no fruit, only succeeding to tighten the ropes around him further. "You bitch! Just you wait. My uncle has already gone to report this to the officials." Wenqing was trying her best to hold back her laughter. If these two clowns before her realized who their master was, they would probably pee their pants in fright. Just as Kai finished speaking, they could hear someone running in from outside Gillen Restaurant's entrance. Following that, a panting middle-aged man entered the main hall. The man proudly pointed at the middle of the hall where Chu Lian's party stood, before turning back to say, "Sirs, these people are the ones who came to cause trouble in our restaurant. Please arrest them, quickly. Right after that, 5 bailiffs with tall figures and fierce expressions came striding into the hall. Each of them had a sword hung at their waists. One of the sturdy-looking bailiffs with a full, curly beard seemed to be their leader. He started roaring when he marched into the hall. Which one of you was so impudent as to commit a crime in broad daylight? Arrest them all. TL note: these bailiffs work for the criminal court. They patrol around their assigned districts and can arrest anyone who's doing something against the law. They are somewhat like a police force in ancient China, but they work directly for the criminal court. Bailiff is my own translation of the Chinese term yi, or literally yamen, criminal court, runners. I went with the British definition of the word: a sheriff's officer who executes writs and processes and carries out distraints and arrests. I'm trying to localize words where I can so it's easier to read, but at the same time, providing enough context like the original Chinese term. Let me know if any terms seem out of place, as my understanding of English might be different from yours. 3. Chapter 165, Teaching a Lesson. 2. When the Boundock Kai and Mrs. Wang saw that the head of their family had come, they shouted for help. 2 of the bailiffs came up to arrest Chu Lian and her servants, but 2 of House Jingan's manservants blocked them while Wenqing and Wenlan hid Chu Lian behind them. Chu Lian wasn't even the slightest bit anxious, even in this situation. Conversely, she felt that this Wang family was being too theatrical. She didn't retreat like they expected. Instead, she stepped forward, chin slightly raised as she looked straight at the leader of the bailiffs with a serious gaze. Dear sir, do think carefully on who you're going to arrest today. If you arrest the wrong person, it won't be good for you. The bearded leader was stunned by Chu Lian's words. He visibly hesitated for a moment. He was just a normal bailiff on patrol on Anna Lane, where most of the population were common citizens. However, in this capital, you could find officials almost anywhere. If you threw a rock, there was a high chance that it might land on some prince or noble. He had managed to eke out a peaceful living with this career thus far due to his caution in dealing with people and making sure not to offend the wrong person. He knew that Gillen Restaurant was owned by House Jingan. Although they were considered a noble house, in this huge capital, they stood somewhere in the middle of the rankings. There were still a bunch of imperial family members and important officials above them. The head bailiff debated with himself for a little longer. While their leader was hesitating, the other bailiffs paused their actions as well. Manager Wang got anxious upon seeing this. Sirs, look at how those people are dressed. They don't look like nobles at all. They're just trying to deceive us all. Don't listen to them. When the leader took a closer look at how Chu Lian's party was dressed, he frowned. As Manager Wang had said, they were only dressed like slightly richer common folk. Chu Lian knew that the bailiff's thoughts had started going in the wrong direction, but she was too lazy to continue this farce further. She looked at Wenqing, and the maidservant quickly moved forward. The bailiff before her tried to stop her, but Wenqing casually leaped up and swept the 2 bailiffs to the floor in just 2 kicks. The bailiffs groaned in pain and couldn't get up. She walked up to the head bailiff and extended the jade token in her hands to the bailiff. When the bearded bailiff saw the jade token, his legs turned to jelly and he almost collapsed to the ground. Imperial family. Wenqing harumphed and kept the jade token before returning back to Chu Lian's side. She then spoke loudly to the bearded bailiff. Do you understand who you're trying to arrest now? The bearded bailiff immediately knelt down in fear and anxiety. This humble one has startled honored one, this humble one deserves to die. The other bailiffs had also recognized the jade token that Wenqing took out. Even Manager Wang managed to get a good look at it. The moment he laid his eyes on that token, Manager Wang felt as if he was about to collapse. His expression was full of utter shock. He hadn't expected this ordinary young madam to have brought out a jade token that only the imperial family was supposed to have. In the Great Wu Dynasty, the Ministry of Internal Affairs would issue a jade token to anyone with a noble title. Although the jade tokens had different carvings on them, the quality was the same, and it was a mark of the imperial family. The token that Chu Lian had given to Wenqing to show had been delivered together with the imperial decree. She hadn't thought that it would come in handy so soon. Once the bearded bailiff came back to his senses, the one to be arrested turned into Manager Wang. Manager Wang didn't dare to say a single word. Even House Jingan was ranked lower than the imperial family. The shouting Mrs. Wang and Ah Kai had also deflated like balloons. Their heads were down and they kept as quiet as a mouse. Chapter 166, Teaching a Lesson, 3. Upon recalling the insults he had thrown at Chu Lian earlier, Ah Kai started to tremble. The face that had been full of fighting spirit earlier was now completely ashen pale in fear. Two bailiffs took the bound Mrs. Wang and Ah Kai off the hands of the manservants. Suddenly, a puddle appeared on the cyan floor tiles, followed by a terrible fishy stink. When Wenqing looked down, she realized that the crotch of Ah Kai's pants were soaked. He had actually peed himself in fright. When Manager Wang saw Ah Kai's state, shame flooded his being. He glared at Ah Kai angrily. This was all that idiot's fault. Manager Wang had just gone to the gambling dens and lost some money. Afraid that Mrs. Wang would find out, he had entered sneakily through the back door and bumped into Ah Kai when he was bringing out the dishes to the main hall. Ah Kai had cooked up this plan to get Manager Wang to bring over some bailiffs they were familiar with to scare Chu Lian and have her cough up more money. Who would have thought that they would shoot themselves in their own foot? Of course Manager Wang was filled with hatred. The bearded bailiff came over to Chu Lian eagerly and bowed at the waist. Does honored one have any other orders? Chu Lian didn't bother speaking with the leader. Instead, she turned to Wenqing and said, "Bring me the account books from the counter." Despite feeling the embarrassment of getting ignored, the bailiff didn't dare to voice any complaints. The gap in their statuses was too great. Furthermore, judging by the ability that the maidservant had showed just now, he didn't dare to underestimate them. Even if this young madam hadn't shown off her imperial identity, the five of them wouldn't have been a match for that one maidservant. When he thought of that, the curly-bearded leader appeared even more respectful and humble. Manager Wang startled when he heard Chu Lian's command. What? The accounts? Someone who was affiliated with the imperial family actually wanted to see the accounts of his little restaurant? There had to be something wrong with that, or he had misheard. Manager Wang gulped in fright. Somehow, he managed to say a few words. Han. Honored one, what's there to see in our little restaurant's books? They are merely a bunch of insignificant numbers. Please do not tire yourself. Chu Lian looked down at Manager Wang. Manager Wang, I forgot to mention this to you. Gillen Restaurant has been given to me by my grandmother. This place will not require your services any longer. It was like Manager Wang had been struck by lightning. The shock factor from this simple sentence of Chu Lian's was worlds above the time she brought out the jade token carrying the insignia of the imperial family. Manager Wang's eyes looked like they were going to pop out of his head. Chu Lian's words echoed in his mind, and when he finally processed what they meant, he immediately knew her true identity. A young madam from House Jingan. Who else could she be other than the third young madam, the most recent addition to the Jingan household? Furthermore, this third young madam had only just received a personal title of honored lady 2 days ago, conferred to her by the emperor. They had just tried to bully their own masters. Had this young madam simply been a member of the imperial family, then their punishment for offending her would have only been spending a few nights in a jail cell. With their connection to House Jingan, they wouldn't have even experienced any hardship. However, things were totally different now. Third young madam was not only a member of the imperial family, but she was also a member of House Jingon. For mere servants of House Jingon, like them, third young madam's words were law. To make matters worse, she was also the new master of Gillen Restaurant. Even if she wanted their lives taken, all she had to do was say the word. A moment after, a wet patch appeared under Manager Wang's crotch as well. The apple didn't fall far from the tree. Both uncle and nephew had peed their pants. What an impressive ability. Chapter 167, Disbelief, 1. This chapter has been stolen from LoveLore novels. Please read from the original source. The bearded bailiff's eyes darted about as he thought. Although the capital was large, there was a great number of people occupying the space. As long as someone intentionally tried to spread some news, even the most boring gossip would spread like wildfire. The house of Count Jingen was also a noble house. When ordinary folk had nothing better to do, they enjoyed discussing interesting tidbits like the private affairs of the noble houses during their meals. A few days ago, when Chu Lian had received an imperial edict and been conferred the title of Honored Lady Genie, House Jingen hadn't hidden the news at all. Chu Lian usually stayed inside the Jingen estate without paying attention to what went on outside, so she had no idea that this matter had already spread throughout the capital. Although there were many members of the imperial family who were conferred titles, House Jingen's third young madam was the first non-imperial family member to receive a personal title in decades, so it was normal for everyone to be surprised. In fact, there were also plenty of noble ladies who were looking for an opportunity to meet this honored Lady Genie as well. Due to a mere fifth-ranked honored lady title, Chu Lian had been pushed to the height of gossip. She had practically become famous overnight among the capital's people. These bailiffs weren't stupid. The leader immediately realized what Chu Lian's identity was. He glared at Manager Wang, wishing he could split that man's head open. What the hell? And he even called himself a servant of the Jingen estate. If he couldn't even recognize his own master, he deserved whatever punishment came to him. The leader's attitude became even more deferential. He even seemed to be trying to curry favor with the flattering lilt of his tone. Honored one, please let this humble one deal with these bad servants who don't know any better for you, so they don't spoil your mood. Chu Lian's brows furrowed together. She really didn't like how this head bailiff had changed his attitude towards her so quickly, like he was merely flipping the pages of a book. She indifferently said, "There's no need for that. I'll send someone to bring them back to the estate, and have the steward personally punish them." No matter how terrible this Wang family's actions had been, they were owned by the matriarch. It wouldn't be proper to use her title and order the bailiffs to deal with them. Certain things should stay within the family, especially as the matriarch was her elder. The leader was rather embarrassed by the rejection, but he had no choice but to keep quiet. When they heard what Chu Lian had said, the three servants were all scared out of their wits and knelt on the floor, begging for forgiveness. Chu Lian didn't want to deal with this annoying family, so she ordered the manservants who had come along with her to stuff their mouths and send them to the steward of the estate. Wenqing politely sent the bailiffs off. Gillen Restaurant's main hall finally settled into silence again. Only Chu Lian and her party were left. It was at this moment that she heard footsteps coming the back. Chu Lian raised her brows. She hadn't thought that there were still other people inside Gillen Restaurant. The curtains in front of the door shifted, revealing a white-haired old man dressed in a rough tunic. When the old man lifted his gaze, he was met with Chu Lian's appraising eyes. He was slightly stunned, but immediately followed with an amiable smile. "May this old servant ask if you're the master of this place?" Wenqing and Wenlan exchanged glances, both wearing identically puzzled expressions on their faces. Wenqing walked up to him and supported him as they walked over to Chu Lian. "Old sir, this is House Jingen's third young madam. The matriarch has already handed over this restaurant to third young madam." The old man's eyes immediately lit up, causing his wrinkled face to look like peels of dried tangerines. There's finally hope for Gillen Restaurant. It can be saved. The old man began to laugh and cry with joy. He used his sleeves to wipe away his tears. Chu Lian was confused. "Old sir, may I ask your identity?" The old man quickly calmed himself down and said, "My apologies, third young madam, this old servant has been inconsiderate. I am the bookkeeper of Gillen Restaurant." The old man's surname was also Wang, but he wasn't related to manager Wang and his family at all. However, the old man was also a servant originally from the Jing'an estate. TL note: a bookkeeper takes care of the account books. Chu Lian and Wenqing are literally calling him old man, but using a very polite term in Chinese. It's used in deference to his greater life experience and knowledge. To give the same context, I tried using old sir to show that they are giving him respect due to his age. 3. Chapter 168, Disbelief. 2. 20 years ago, the old man had been sent to Gillen Restaurant to be a bookkeeper. He had toiled away, doing enough careful and conscientious work for a lifetime. Although he should have retired back to the Jing'an estate at such an age, when he saw how Gillen Restaurant's business was failing in the hands of the Wang family, he couldn't bear to just leave. The old count had saved bookkeeper Wang a long time ago, when bookkeeper Wang had been a wounded soldier. Due to his age, he hadn't tried to look for a wife after recuperating from his injuries, so he didn't have any relatives back at the estate. He hadn't been able to contend against the Wang family in his circumstances either, so he could only continue to bide his time in Gillen Restaurant. "Please wait here, third young madam." Bookkeeper Wang walked to the back of the restaurant and soon returned with a small wooden box. He held up the box with 2 hands and passed it to Chu Lian. "Third young madam, these are the accounts that this old servant has been privately keeping. Please have a look." It turned out that manager Wang had stopped letting bookkeeper Wang handle the accounts for quite some time already. The books that he handed over to the family were merely forged. Since bookkeeper Wang couldn't do anything about that, he had secretly made his own copies while waiting for the day that he could hand it to his masters. Chu Lian hadn't expected this old man to have done this. Although she knew inside that the accounts he had kept were practically useless to her now, she still received it with gratitude. The fruits of someone's hard work, whether small or large, sweet or sour, should be received with the importance and respect they deserve. "Thank you for your hard work, Mr. Bookkeeper." Chu Lian sincerely thanked him. Manager Wang smiled so widely that his eyes turned into slits. "Don't say that, third young madam, it is this old servant's duty." Following that, bookkeeper Wang showed her around Gillen Restaurant. There was a woman over 40 who did chores for the restaurant in the backyard. Bookkeeper Wang had been able to stay safe and sound all this time because she had taken care of him throughout the time of the Wang family's exploitation. Chu Lian stood in the backyard, examining the layout of the whole building. Although Gillen Restaurant wasn't very eye-catching from the outside and couldn't be compared to the majestic restaurants on Zhuke Avenue, it had its own charms. Gillen Restaurant's layout was like a gourd. It had a small entrance, but the area inside was huge. The backyard even had 2 sections, which made up for the lack of a second floor. The buildings on either side of Gillen Restaurant were both ordinary homes. According to bookkeeper Wang, ever since the West Market had been shifted, the properties on Anil Lane had lost their value. In fact, one of the neighboring properties had been empty all this time, and nobody was staying there. Bookkeeper Wang led Chu Lian into the second section of the backyard and explained, "Initially, this courtyard was meant for guests, but ever since the business took a dive, the Wang family took it over for themselves." Chu Lian entered the courtyard and noted the elaborate design. There was some mottled bamboo planted in a corner with a small decorative mountain beside it. Beside the mountain were some stone tables and stools. On the other side, there was a small cluster of banana trees. The corridor leading up to the main building in this courtyard was covered in wisterias. Interestingly, on the side of the building facing the banana trees, there was a small music room for playing the zither. Although there were no longer any zither or incense burners in it and it had long been filled up with junk, Chu Lien could still imagine what Gillen restaurant looked like decades ago. This losing business had completely exceeded Chu Lien's expectations. Chu Lien chatted with the old bookkeeper for an hour or so before taking the wooden box full of account books with her and leaving in the carriage. Chapter 169, Disbelief, 3. This chapter has been stolen from LoveLore novels. Please read from the original source. Bookkeeper Wang and the middle-aged woman who did chores escorted Chu Lien all the way to the entrance of the alley. The white-haired bookkeeper Wang kept watching the carriage as it left and entered the bustling main street. He finally heaved a sigh of relief, but his clouded old eyes didn't seem to hold much hope. He turned around and used a cane for support as he hobbled back to Gillen restaurant. The middle-aged woman who was supporting him on his other side heard a soft, unmistakable sigh from him. She didn't understand why he was sighing and asked, "Mr. Wang, the estate has sent third young madam here to fix the restaurant. Shouldn't you be happy?" The old bookkeeper paused and looked around them. He gave a bitter smile. In a place like this, how could we possibly regain our former glory? Actually, the old bookkeeper didn't believe that Gillen restaurant could return to its glory days. He was experienced enough to determine this after living so many years and working as a bookkeeper in Gillen restaurant for 20 years. He had lived through the ups and downs of this restaurant's life as well. The world was ever-changing. It wasn't as if the Wang family was the only reason that the restaurant hadn't been doing well. All of the famous tea houses, restaurants, silversmiths, and goldsmiths in the capital were located in bustling, lively districts. There was an old saying that fit this situation: a dead district is a dead business. Restaurants needed a constant flow of people to survive. The middle-aged woman couldn't quite understand the bookkeeper's meaning. She thought rather simply. In her eyes, as long as their master had money, anything could be done. Was there anything that couldn't be done with money? Old sir, aren't you thinking too negatively? See, since third young madam came today, she already threw out the Wang family. That was a delight. It was clear that this middle-aged servant had also suffered torment under the Wang family. Mrs. Li, how could you possibly understand? Just wait and see. The old bookkeeper didn't bother trying to explain further. He slowly walked back to Gillen restaurant. Honestly speaking, third young madam was just a young girl who had just come of age. Even if she had been raised well with the bearing and talents of a noble lady, it wasn't an easy task to revive a failing restaurant, especially in a residential district like this one. Even if she had a noble title backing her, reviving this old restaurant still wasn't going to be easy. Back in the carriage, Chu Lien didn't know that the old bookkeeper didn't have a shred of confidence in her. She was peeking out from the curtains of the carriage to look outside from time to time. It hadn't been easy for her to come out alone today. Wouldn't it be such a waste if she didn't go out for some shopping before returning home? Wenqing and Wenlan had also noticed Chu Lien's interest. They exchanged smiles. Wenqing said, "Third young madam, this servant can act as your guide, if you wish." Chu Lien turned to look at Wenqing, her eyes wide with surprise. "You're familiar with this place?" Wenlan pressed her lips together to hide her smile. She was a little more introverted than Wenqing and usually spoke less. If she could avoid it, she would rather not speak. Whenever she was with Wenqing, it was always Wenqing who would speak for them. Third young madam, this servant and Wenqing both grew up in the streets of the capital. It was only in the past 2 years that we lived with senior servant Zhong on an estate. However, we came out to buy things quite often, so we're very familiar with the capital. Chu Lien blinked. Her eyes lit up in pleasant surprise. Wow! So they were like living maps. Tell me about the capital, quickly. Although the original Chu Lian had also lived in the capital since birth, she was the legitimate daughter of a noble house, so she rarely left her estate. How could she be familiar with the common roads and markets like Wenqing? In the gentle shaking of the carriage, Wenqing smiled as she explained the lay of the land to Chu Lian. Third young madam, we're about to leave the boundaries of Chongping Lane. After we pass this small street, Pingkong Lane will be in front of us. To the left of Pingkong Lane was the East Market, while Xianyang Lane was to its south. To the north was Chunming Avenue, where most of the important officials stayed. This included the visiting officials normally stationed in other parts of the country, as well as some of the up-and-coming scholar candidates. For example, Lord Yang's official residence was located in Pingkong Lane. Chu Lian lifted the curtain and curiously peeked outside. Suddenly, a figure cut into her line of sight. Chapter 170, Something Fishy, 1. This chapter has been stolen from LoveLore novels. Please read from the original source. Although she had only met that person once before, Chu Lian knew she would never forget his face. Back when she had returned to her maiden family for a visit, Chu Lian had served him tea together with Yi Changdi as a rite of respect. His attitude had been cool and indifferent as he received the cup of tea and returned to them a red envelope, just as if he were merely conducting some routine business transaction. Then, when she had been led away by the womenfolk of the family, he hadn't given a single word of advice to her, his own daughter. She didn't know if the biological father of her current body was happy with his new son-in-law, Yi Changdi, or whether or not they had bonded together over some wine. Chu Qijing was dressed in an elaborately embroidered gray brocade robe. He stood before the entrance to an estate with some manservants by his side. He was pacing back and forth, seemingly anxious and impatient. In actual fact, this second master of House Ingguo wasn't considered that old. He was only 35. He didn't keep a beard or mustache, and he had a jade crown on his head. Coupled with his slender figure, he looked about 6 or 7 years younger than his actual age. Chu Lian's almond-shaped eyes slightly narrowed. She looked up at the signboard above the residence he was standing in front of, which read Pan Estate. As she watched, a servant who had been guarding the doors quickly ran into the estate. Shortly after, 2 strongly built retainers carrying swords came out together with the servant who had gone in. The servant pointed in the direction of Chu Qijing and his party. The 2 retainers strode over to Chu Qijing in a few steps. One of the retainers pushed Chu Qijing forcefully. If not for Chu Qijing's personal manservant reacting quickly and catching him, he might have been completely pushed onto the ground and lost all his face. Immediately after that, Chu Qijing's expression contorted and he started arguing with the retainers. His personal manservants could tell that the Pan Estate's retainers had some martial arts skill, so they shielded Chu Qijing behind them. The 2 retainers were annoyed by Chu Qijing's scolding. Their rage showed clearly on their faces and their hands shifted towards the swords they carried at their waists, as if they might draw them at any moment. Chu Lian knocked on the carriage wall and ordered the driver to slow down a little. She lifted the curtain a little and continued watching the entrance of the Pan Estate, but she did nothing else. She wasn't the original Chu Lian, after all. Upon receiving such cold treatment from this father of hers during the tea ceremony, she already understood that she wasn't loved by him. Chu Lian didn't care much for that. She was someone who would give as much as she got. Since Chu Qijing didn't care for her, she wouldn't bother going out of her way for him. Wasn't it more fun to simply sit back and watch the drama? When Wenqing noticed third young madam's instructions to the driver, she peeked out of the window as well. When she noticed the signboard on top of the estate's entrance, she gasped quietly and exclaimed, "The Pan Estate." Wen Lan saw that Chu Lian seemed to be intently watching the show, so she secretly pushed Wenqing a little. Wenqing quickly covered her mouth, and her eyes blinked in apology. Chu Lian didn't have the mood to care about what Wenqing had been surprised about. Her eyes were fixed on the drama unfolding in front of the Pan Estate's entrance. Just as the two retainers were about to use force, a carriage came out from the alley next to the Pan Estate's entrance. The carriage quickly stopped in front of the entrance. The manservant guarding the doors ran to the carriage and eagerly lifted the curtain doors before helping a white-haired, bearded old man who looked to be about 50 or 60 off the carriage. At this distance, Chu Lian couldn't hear what they were saying at all. The white-haired man was about to enter the estate immediately, but he seemed to have heard something that Chu Qijing had shouted while being restrained by the retainers. He abruptly turned around and sent a shocked and dangerous-looking gaze towards Chu Qijing. The bearded old man stopped outside the Pan Estate's mahogany doors with his hands behind his back and looked at Chu Qijing, as if trying to bore a hole through him with his gaze alone. Time seemed to slow from the intensity of this man's gaze. Finally, the man waved away the two retainers. Chu Qijing's originally nervous expression finally relaxed. He even seemed to be a little pleased with himself. A hint of evil shone in his eyes. Chu Qijing forcefully pushed away the two retainers who had been holding him back. After doing so, he seemed to feel relieved of his frustration from before. He even kicked at them twice. After releasing his previous frustration, Chu Qijing smoothed out his clothing, which had turned to disarray from the scuffle. He placed his hands behind his back and strode into the Pan Estate with his manservants. It wasn't until Chu Qijing's figure had disappeared past the first wall of the Pan Estate that Chu Lian let down the curtain. A few expressions flitted across her face. Her original desire to go shopping in the capital had been completely erased by witnessing this strange incident. Chu Lian lowered her head in thought. Wenqing and Wenlan didn't dare to disturb her, so they sat in silence by her side. After a long moment, Chu Lian finally lifted her head and turned to Wenqing. Wenqing, which official in the capital occupies the Pan Estate? She remembered that Wenqing had gasped in surprise just now, so the owner of the Pan Estate must be someone important in the ranks of the court. Wenqing replied honestly, "Third young madam, the Pan Estate of Pingkong Lane is owned by Pan Golao." At the moment, there were 5 ministers in the cabinet. Amongst these 5, they were also ranked differently. This Pan Golao was the man who had the highest status amongst the cabinet. He was only 1 rank below the imperial scribe, a real first-ranked official. Chu Lian didn't care much about the court matters of the Great Wu dynasty. In the portion of the original novel that she had read, there was no mention of this high and mighty Lord Pan, so she wouldn't know anything about him. Chu Lian nodded. "I understand now." Chapter 171, Something Fishy, 2. This chapter has been stolen from LoveLore novels. Please read from the original source. Although Wenqing seemed to be curious about the identity of the middle-aged man Third Young Madam had been staring at, since Third Young Madam didn't seem to want to speak about it, she held back her questions. The servants who had accompanied her today were all from House Jing'an, so none of them had recognized Chu Qijing as her father. When Chu Lian heard Wenqing's reply, she slipped back into deep thought. Judging by that situation just now, Lord Pan hadn't wanted to see her father at all. What changed his mind was something that her father had said at the last minute. Back then, Lord Pan's expression had looked very complicated, with a bunch of emotions all mixed together. It could send shivers down anyone's spine. In the slowly declining House Ingwa, Chu Qijing wasn't the eldest son, nor someone who was very smart. He clung onto the protection of his family to survive. Up until now, he hadn't managed to get even a low-ranked slack official position in court. He was essentially useless. This kind of noble would normally keep meeting the same small number of friends to pass the time. They wouldn't interact with officials who held actual power in court. Lord Pan hadn't even glanced at Chu Qijing when he first arrived at the estate. However, after Chu Qijing said something, Lord Pan had not only looked at him, he had even invited him into his estate. It was clear that they were going to be discussing something related to business. Could her father have found something to use against Lord Pan? But Chu Lien found this thought too ridiculous. She shook her head and snorted. How could that be possible? How could someone in a high position of power like Lord Pan be an average person? Those with power had to have the charisma, ambition, and cunning to get them there in the first place. Even if Lord Pan didn't have all of those traits, he likely had one or two at the very least. The very notion that an idle noble like her father, who played around all day, could somehow outplay Lord Pan, who held actual authority in his hands, was laughable. Even the thought of Chu Qijing holding some sort of weakness of Lord Pan's was absurd. Perhaps not even a child would believe that. Furthermore, Hao Xinghua had never been connected with the Pan estate. The two men had probably never even met before, so the chances of such a thing decreased even further. Chu Lien frowned and tried to recall the events of the book. However, she couldn't think of any details relevant to the current situation as it was now. In the end, she could only give up. She would cross that bridge when she came to it. Even if her father was plotting something, it was none of her business now. Married daughters were like water. Once thrown out, they were no longer connected to their original family. She was now a member of House Jingyan as he Sanlang's wife. After reassuring herself, Chu Lien finally relaxed. When Wenqing saw that Chu Lien's expression had relaxed, she spoke up and asked, "Third young madam, would you still like to shop around?" By this time, they had already left Pingkong Lane and were driving along Zhuke Avenue. Chu Lien had already lost her initial anticipation after witnessing that scene. She was about to order them to return home directly, but she suddenly remembered that it would be Countess Jingyan's birthday in a few days. She didn't have a suitable gift for her mother-in-law yet. Thus, she held back her words. Let's look for a few stores to shop in. Mother's birthday is coming. Although she didn't have to buy something extremely valuable for her mother-in-law's birthday and Countess Jingyan wasn't one to mind, the entire estate knew that she had received a nice sum of money from Imperial Concubine Wei, thanks to Imperial Princess Liao's golden qilin. When she had been given the title of Honored Lady, she had also received an award of 100 gold taels. If she didn't spend a good amount of money on Countess Jingyan's gift, she might draw the gossip of certain jealous people. Chu Lien inwardly sighed. That sister-in-law of hers, Madame Zhou, was waiting for her to make a mistake. How could she let Madame Zhou have any chance of reprimanding her or punishing her? It didn't matter what gift she picked this time. It just had to be suitably expensive. She could have claimed that she didn't have any money in the past, but she couldn't do that now. Chu Lien pouted, feeling a little angry inside. It was just 2 measly awards, but the people around her were already jealous. How annoying. She was better off hiding whatever money she made in the future. Her husband wasn't by her side, so there was a real chance that someone else might try to take the money from her using all sorts of reasons. Wenqing lifted up the curtains a little and pointed at the stores on both sides of Zhuke Avenue. She introduced them to Chu Lien one by one. Third young madam, that's Hengxing Medicine Hall, Luoha Calligraphy, Lanchao Clothing, and oh, that one over there is Jinshi Pavilion. These are all famous stores in the capital. Many high-ranked nobles and young ladies like to shop here. Chu Lien nodded. Since she hadn't thought of what she wanted to buy, she decided to look around each of them. Wenqing told the driver to stop and she helped Chu Lien off the carriage together with Wen Lan. There were many people walking on Zhuke Avenue. Some richly dressed men and women would also pass by from time to time. Chu Lien looked around her. Her impression of the Great Wu dynasty increased a notch. This dynasty wasn't as restrictive towards the freedom of its women, unlike the old Song and Ming dynasties. The openness of this dynasty seemed more like the early Tang. Most of the ladies out here didn't even cover their heads while they were out. There were even women studying at the capital's Imperial College. It was normal for noble ladies to be out shopping as well. Chu Lian entered Hengqing Medicine Hall first. For the sake of her incognito visit today, she had dressed plainly. Her clothes were made of ordinary fabric. With two young maids like Wenqing and Wenlan by her side, she looked like the newlywed wife of a minor official. When she entered the medicine hall, none of the staff came up to greet her. Chu Lian didn't mind this at all. She slowly looked around the store with Wenqing and Wenlan. TL note: if you didn't check out the announcement post for this chapter, please read it here. TMR's author sent a message specially for the readers of the English translation, so I'm collecting messages from all of us to send to her. The message and link is in the announcement post. Chapter 172, Digging a Hole for Herself. 1. This chapter has been stolen from LoveLore novels. Please read from the original source. Chu Lian had taken a class on traditional Chinese medicine back when she was in university, so she could recognize a few types of herbs. She wasn't too good at it until she read a few wilderness survival books later on and became somewhat familiar with the basics. Now that she was browsing through a medicine hall, she understood quite a bit. Chu Lian even picked up one or two types of herbs and took a sniff to check their quality, but that was the limit of her abilities. Right across the street from Hengqing Medicine Hall was the most famous jewelry store in the capital, Jinshi Pavilion. At this moment, there were a few young ladies standing at a counter in Jinshi Pavilion, chattering away. Their eyes were lit up with excitement as they looked at the accessories a female manager was showing to them, probably so they could try them on. These ladies weren't strangers to Chu Lian, they were a few legitimate daughters of Hao Xing. They had originally come out with two of their older brothers escorting them, but when they had reached Jinshi Pavilion, the two young masters had found excuses to leave, not wanting to accompany their sisters to jewelry shop. Now, only the young girls were left in the store, discussing their accessories happily. Fifth Miss Su took a liking to a lustrous, transparent green jade bangle. Although the quality of the jade wasn't the best, it won in its vibrant color. Its hue alternated between green and blue, like the image of a flowing river. During this hot summer, it was especially cool and refreshing. When worn on her slender, fair wrist, it brought out the color of her skin. She couldn't resist asking the female manager, "Manager, how much is this bangle?" The manager smiled and replied, "This jade bangle does match your fair and slender wrist very well, miss. What a good eye you have." As she said so, she brought out an exquisite wooden box from under the counter and opened it. There was a matching pair of jade earrings in the box, shaped like teardrops and extremely beautiful. "Miss, if these earrings are to your liking, why don't you have these earrings for free together with the bangle? Then this madam will simply accept 50 taels for it. What do you think?" 50 taels. Although that wasn't considered much, it was a little expensive for young noble ladies like them, who only received a small monthly allowance. The legitimate daughters of Hao Xing only received 8 taels of silver for their monthly allowance. A single jade bangle from Jinshi Pavilion actually cost half a year's worth of their allowance. Miss Su had brought 60 taels out today, but those 60 taels were the result of half a year's worth of saving. It was still too much for her to hand them all over for a single bangle. She was still thinking of buying another set of accessories for her mother. The corners of Miss Su's lips tugged downwards and she set down the bangle. Her eyes carried a trace of unwillingness as she said, "Manager, I'll look at something else." The manager seemed to notice her difficulty. However, she didn't say anything more. Without any change in expression, she brought out cheaper accessories for her to choose from. While holding a golden hairpin inlaid with jade and pearls, Miss Yuan chuckled, "Fifth sister, you've brought more than 50 taels out today. Are you so miserly that you can't even bear to buy a single jade bangle?" Eighth Miss Yuan's words made Miss Su flush. Miss Su pressed her lips together, but didn't say anything in reply. She lowered her head to look at the new set of ornaments, pretending she didn't hear anything. Miss Yuan chuckled again and passed the golden hairpin in her hands to the manager, boldly saying, "Manager, pack up this hairpin for me." The manager hadn't expected this young lady to be so generous. Her smile seeped into her eyes as she brought an exquisite box over to place the hairpin in. This young lady has a good eye, too. This golden hairpin has 3 emeralds on it, each of them the same size. The style of the flowers on top of it is good, too, only 2 flowers, simple yet elegant. It matches perfectly with the pink dress you're wearing today, miss. This hairpin is the handiwork of our master Lu. This madam will set the price low at 150 taels, just for you, miss. TL note, Pesht, please submit your messages to TMR's author through this form instead of writing in the comments. https://goo.gl/form/fc7kw40kdy6imu2. Chapter 173, Digging a Hole for Herself, 2. This chapter has been stolen from LoveLore Novels. Please read from the original source. When the manager had been complimenting her, Miss Yuan had her nose so high in the air she was about to start floating away in pride. She had good taste to have picked such a beautiful hairpin. It was so much better than that silly bangle that 5th Miss Su had picked. However, when she heard what the price was, Miss Yuan's expression froze in place. What? 150 taels? Why didn't the manager simply steal the money from her? It was just a golden hairpin. Miss Yuan had seen that this golden hairpin would definitely be more expensive than Miss Su's jade bangle, but she thought that it would cost 100 taels at maximum. She had begged for 100 taels from her mother so she could go shopping today, and in addition to that, she had also brought 30 or so taels from her own savings. Even a young lady of a first-ranked noble house would bring out only a little more than 100 taels at most. How could she, of the declining housing, take out even more than them? If they had been shopping at Jincher Jewelry next door, the 130 taels she had brought would be more than enough. However, this was the high-class Jincher pavilion that they were perusing. She had originally thought of showing up Miss Su and shaming her. In the Ying estate, it was only this unmarried 5th Miss who continued to be at loggerheads with her, the 8th Mississippi. She was going to make Miss Su eat dirt today in public so that she would fight her less in the future. However, she hadn't thought that she would be digging a hole for herself as well. She only carried 130-something taels on her right now. Miss Yuan's expression turned ugly. Due to her conflicting emotions and present embarrassment, her face went red, then white. She opened her mouth and met with the manager's eager gaze. Though she wanted to withdraw her previous claims, the words were stuck in her throat and wouldn't come out. Miss Yuan's panicked gaze darted around the shop. Her personal maidservant's expression was even uglier. She looked like she was about to cry from her anxiety. She even tugged at her master's sleeve carefully. If 8th Miss really bought a golden hairpin for 150 taels, 2nd Madam would surely scold her up and down. Most of the madam's own accessories and ornaments cost less than 100 taels. 8th Miss would simply get a reprimand and a lecture, but as her personal maidservant, she could be dragged out of the estate and sold. 5th Miss and 9th Miss weren't dumb. In a few moments, they quickly noticed the dilemma that 8th Miss was in. 9th Miss Fu smirked and began to provoke her. "Ah, 8th sister hasn't said anything. You can't possibly be feeling embarrassed because you didn't bring enough money, right? Well, if you didn't bring enough, it's understandable. We're all unmarried ladies here, so it's normal that we don't have much money to spend. It's fine if we don't buy this and get something cheaper. The manager won't laugh at us." The manager served the wives and daughters of nobles and important officials every day. She was good at observing other people's expressions. Although she was disdainful of the group of girls before her, she didn't show it on her face. She simply nodded and played along. However, Miss Yuan felt even more keenly that she couldn't get out of the trap she had sprung on herself. She was used to acting high and mighty. Before Chu Lian had gotten married, she had always been competing with Chu Lian in every aspect of their lives. Though Chu Lian was now married and no longer in the Ying estate, there was still the main branch and the third branch to contend with. The master of the second branch, Chu Qizheng, had no achievements to speak of, so the ladies of the second branch had always kept their heads a little lower when the other branches were around. This was also why second madam had given her 100 taels to spend upon finding out that she was going shopping with the sisters of the main and third branches. As tough as life was inside the estate, they couldn't lose face out in public. Miss Yuan's chest was heaving up and down from the frustration brought about by Ninth Miss's words. However, the fact of the matter was, she just didn't have enough money, so she couldn't get off this high horse once she had gotten on. She could only bite her lip until it bled and grind her teeth into dust. Miss Yuan raised her head and was about to admit that she hadn't brought enough taels, when she spotted a familiar figure out of the corner of her eyes. Chapter 174, Digging a Hole for Herself, 3. This chapter has been stolen from LoveLore Novels. Please read from the original source. Miss Yuan was a little surprised, but the cogs in her mind quickly turned and she thought of a way to escape her troublesome situation. The effects were instant. The color in her face returned, and now that she had a solution, she immediately swallowed the words she had been about to say and recovered. Fifth Miss and Ninth Miss couldn't figure out why her expression had suddenly changed so quickly, like she'd been flipping through a book and gone from the climax to the resolution. Miss Yuan didn't mention the golden hairpin. Strangely enough, she took a step to the side and grabbed Fifth Miss Sue's arm, acting like they were a pair of true sisters from the same branch as if the past minute hadn't ever happened. Fifth sister, ninth sister, look across the street. Isn't that sixth sister? What a coincidence. We just bumped into her the moment we got a chance to go out. Miss Yuan pointed over to Hengxing Medicine Hall. It just so happened that Chu Lian had turned around and led her two maidservants out of the medicine hall. One of the maidservants bent down to whisper into her ear, and Chu Lian seemed to be listening intently and nodding. Since she was out in the open, Miss Su and Miss Fu could recognize her clearly. Wasn't that Chu Lian, who must be enjoying a life of luxury after marrying into House Jingyan? They watched as Chu Lian led her two maidservants across Zhuke Avenue. Weren't they heading this way and coming into Jinshi Pavilion? None of the staff had bothered to wait on them in Hengxing Medicine Hall, and Chu Lian hadn't seen any precious medicinal ingredients on display on the counters, so she gave up. Furthermore, she wasn't too sure on what Countess Jingyan's condition was. Medicine wasn't always good for the body, so it was better not to give her mother-in-law something to be ingested. After listening to Wenqing's recommendation, Chu Lian decided to head into Jinshi Pavilion for a look. When she reached the center of Zhuke Avenue, she looked up at Jinshi Pavilion and spotted some familiar figures. If not for the fact that the people inside had already seen her, she would have definitely turned right around and ran the other way. Associating with the ladies of her maiden family, especially with that half-sister of hers around, was never a good thing. Chu Lian couldn't resist looking up to the sky and wondering if her luck was that bad today. She had met with a bunch of unlucky events already, and now here was one more. Chu Lian pressed her lips and asked Wenqing, "Is it possible to run away now?" Wenqing saw that the three luxuriously dressed ladies were walking their way, clearly about to welcome their third young madam, so she could only heartlessly shatter Chu Lian's dream. "We can't, third young madam. They're on their way to welcome you." "Wenqing, don't you know martial arts? Can't you fly into the air, walk on the walls, and take me away? I really don't want to meet those people." Wenqing had a difficult expression as she replied, "Third young madam, have you been reading too many stories? Even the dragon and tiger guards can't fly and walk on walls, let alone this servant and Wenlan." Chu Lian could only hang her head and sigh in distress. She was resigned to her fate. In a pitiful voice, Chu Lian said, "Then you'll have to protect me later, or else I'll get bullied by those people." Wenqing was speechless. She had already gone out with Chu Lian a few times before. Even if third young madam was a physically weak, young lady, had she ever really been bullied by anyone they met? It was always third young madam who angered her opponents until they could choke to death on their rage. She pressed her lips together, no longer willing to reply. She became even quieter than Wenlan. Chu Lian could only harumph, acting disappointed. "You girls are becoming more and more boring." In the time it took for their conversation to end, they had already reached the main entrance of Jinshi Pavilion and the other three misses had already come out to welcome them. Fifth miss was in the front with a slight smile. It made her round face look a little more innocent. "What a coincidence, sixth sister. Who could have thought that we'd meet here on Juke Avenue?" Miss Yuan stood behind Miss Su, eyeing Chu Lian up and down. Chu Lian was only wearing a plain, light blue dress with a simple jade hairpin in her hair. She didn't even have a single bangle on her wrist. This poor appearance looked even shabbier than when she had been living in the Yin estate. Chapter 175, Fishing for a Gift. 1. This chapter has been stolen from LoveLore novels. Please read from the original source. It looked like Chu Lian wasn't living the life of luxury like she had expected. After jumping to conclusions, Miss Yuan's anger from Miss Su and Miss Fu's provocation subsided. Chu Lian nodded at these sisters of hers. She was a titled noble madam now, so she didn't need to make any bigger gestures of respect towards them. Miss Su invited Chu Lian into Jinshi Pavilion. In an abnormal display of behavior, Miss Yuan walked close to Chu Lian's side and bumped Wenlan away before grabbing onto Chu Lian's arms and calling her sixth sister. Chu Lian felt goosebumps rising all over her body thanks to Miss Yuan's overly intimate tone. Her gaze landed on Miss Yuan's hands wrapped around her left arm, and she didn't bother hiding the disgust she felt in her eyes. Miss Yuan's gaze met hers, but she acted as if she hadn't noticed how annoyed she was. Conversely, she acted as if they were best friends, flattering her with, "Sixth sister, we heard about your noble title. We just didn't have the time to visit you in the Jing'an estate to congratulate you. You won't blame this sister, would you?" Chu Lian snorted inwardly. If Hao Xing really cared about this matter, then they would have made it known to her, instead of waiting for Miss Yuan to mention it now after they had ran into each other. Although it was rare to get the honored lady title, it was just a low-ranking title without any imperial privilege. It wouldn't affect the court a single bit. To Hao Xing, she was no longer part of their family once she got married. Her parents didn't care about her either, so it was normal to receive such cold treatment from them. Luckily, she wasn't the original Chu Lian, so this was completely fine to her. What was there to complain about? She had more freedom now than they would have ever given her back there. Since Hao Xing had drawn the lines between them, they would have to think again if they wanted to make use of their connection in the future. Chu Lian really didn't want to play nice with them at all, but they were out in public now, so she had to care about keeping up House Jing'an's reputation. She said with good temper, "I won't blame you, it's just a small matter." Miss Yuan rolled her eyes, and a corner of her mouth hooked up. Her expression practically screamed, "At least you're smart enough to realize that." Wenqing almost choked on her anger upon seeing that expression. Her hands balled into fists as she felt outrage on behalf of her master. Miss Su was about 2 steps in front of them as she listened to their conversation. Her brows drew together in a frown. Afraid that Miss Yuan would chase Chu Lian away with her provocation, she quickly tried to smooth out the tense atmosphere. "Sixth sister, have you come to Jinshi Pavilion to pick out some accessories as well?" By this time, the Ying sisters had reached Jinshi Pavilion's main hall. Chu Lian didn't want to let them know that she was here to pick out a birthday present for Countess Jingyan, so she casually nodded. Miss Su's eyes darkened a little. Ever since the incident at the Dingyuan estate, she could feel the distance that Chu Lian was putting between her, Madame Rome, and the whole of Housing. Back at the Dingyuan estate, she hadn't jumped out to support Chu Lian at the first hint of something wrong, and she had always felt guilty over it. Seeing Chu Lian's attitude towards them, she dropped the conversation. The main hall of Jinshi Pavilion was decorated elegantly and lavishly. There were small rest areas with tables, chairs, and incense burners behind the screens of the main hall for the noble madams and ladies to rest. There was even a tea room in the building in the back. When the four ladies sat down, maidservants came up to serve them sin cha. The same manager came up to serve them personally. Miss Fu's eyes glanced over Chu Lian's outfit and a tinge of disdain filled her expression. The three branches of Housing had never been at peace with each other. Even if Chu Lian had married out of Housing, she was still a lady from the second branch. From Miss Fu's perspective, she and Miss Yuan were on the same boat. Now that the chance had fallen into her lap, how could Miss Fu not make use of it? Miss Fu faked envy as she looked at Chu Lian. It was really a matter of pride for our Housing when sixth sister received that personal title from the emperor. Grandmother even praised sixth sister in front of me 2 days ago. It even made me a little jealous. Grandmother also said that the imperial family usually bestows material awards when the emperor personally gives out an honored lady title. I heard that it's usually at least a few hundred taels of gold, and that's not counting the number of dresses and accessories you must have received. I'm really quite envious of you. Miss Su hadn't expected Miss Fu to have brought that topic up. She shot a warning look at Miss Fu. Miss Yuan's eyes abruptly lit up with greed before it was quickly replaced with jealousy and unhappiness. Chu Lian remained unmoved. She simply continued watching the ladies before her with wide eyes, inwardly wanting to laugh. Miss Fu hadn't even done her research before trying to make up this lie. The original Chu Lian had probably met the old madam of Housing maybe twice a year at most. Any servant in the Ying estate knew that the old madam didn't like this daughter from the second branch at all. How could she have possibly done something so out of character as praising her? Also, getting a reward of a few hundred gold taels from a measly honored lady title. Did she think that the imperial treasury was a mountain of gold and silver? Miss Fu's words were just too fantastical. She was probably only able to hoodwink the narrow-minded Miss Yuan. Even Jinshi Pavilion's manager hadn't moved at all. She clearly didn't think much about what Miss Fu had said. When Miss Fu finished speaking, she cast a measuring gaze over Chu Lian and Miss Yuan, smirking with bad intentions. The single motive she had for saying something like that was to provoke that eighth Miss, Chu Yuan. Chu Yuan had clearly gotten hooked. Back then, when they had both been unmarried ladies of Housing, she had been better at Chu Lian in everything. Food, living standards, even her monthly allowance had been 10 taels higher than Chu Lian's. When Chu Lian had gotten married, second madam had used some underhanded measures to cut the original sum of 1,000 taels by half. She had been especially happy back then, because her mother had given her half of the confiscated silver. However, things were different now. It was bad enough that Chu Lian had gotten a noble title and a personal name from the emperor. She had actually gotten that much in rewards. A few hundred taels of gold. How could she hold back her jealousy? The plan that she had thought of just now came to mind again. Chapter 176, Fishing for a Gift, 2. This chapter has been stolen from LoveLore novels. Please read from the original source. Chu Yuan held back the jealousy in her heart and forced herself to show a smile. I didn't expect sixth sister to have become so rich. No wonder you've come to Jinshi Pavilion. I took a liking to an accessory just now, it's only 100 or so taels of silver. That must be nothing to sixth sister. Perhaps sixth sister could buy it for your little sister? Chu Yuan wanted all of Chu Lian's gold to be hers. However, she couldn't just snatch all of it in one go, she could only resort to these small tricks to make away with it bit by bit. When Chu Yuan finished speaking, she shot a glance at the manager. The manager knew that these ladies were fighting, so she didn't say much. She simply brought out the accessory that Miss Yuan wanted earlier and placed it on the table in front of the ladies. She smiled as she introduced it to Chu Lian. Madam, this young miss in yellow took a liking to this jade bangle earlier, 50 taels. This golden hairpin with emerald inlays is the one that the lady next to you chose, 150 taels. As for the youngest miss here, she picked this pearl and gold bracelet, 60 taels. Not a single one of them was cheap. When the manager secretly glanced at the humbly dressed Chu Lian, she was surprised. Dressed like that, who could have recognized her as the subject of the latest gossip in the capital, honored Lady Jeannie? The manager only took a quick look and didn't dare to stare too openly. She was trying to guess if honored Lady Jeannie was really that poor, or if she had purposely dressed like this for a reason. Chu Lian reached out with her slender fingers and looked over each of the 3 accessories carefully. She kept nodding, seemingly satisfied. However, when she put the last item back into the brocade box, her brows drew together and she seemed a little put on the spot. As expected of accessories made by Jinshi Pavilion, they're made quite finely. As she said so, Chu Lian showed a slight trace of embarrassment on her face. Miss Fu and the others had been closely observing Chu Lian, so when Miss Fu spotted that minute change of expression, she inwardly snorted. She had guessed it right. So what if she was House Jing'an's third young madam? Or honored Lady Jeannie? Judging by her shabby appearance today, she probably wasn't passing her days very well in the Jing'an estate. She probably wouldn't even be able to take out 100 taels of silver, going by her expression. We're still young, so we chose simpler accessories. These 3 ornaments don't even add to 300 taels. It's not a small sum for us, but it must be barely anything to sixth sister. Sixth sister is an honored lady that the emperor personally named. Miss Fu added on evilly. Chu Lian rolled her eyes in her mind. If 300 taels isn't much, why don't you just rob me directly? 300 taels would be enough for a commoner's family to live out their whole lives. Chu Lian put on a troubled smile. Ninth sister, what are you saying? Miss Su had also detected Chu Lian's floundering, so she reprimanded Miss Fu. Ninth sister, how could we possibly ask sixth sister to pay for our shopping? Don't make trouble for her. Fifth sister, that's an unjust accusation. How could sixth sister be troubled by a mere 300 taels? Chu Lian could have claimed not to have any money in the past, because that was the truth. However, thanks to that honored lady title, she couldn't just claim to be poor now. Her noble title meant that her actions affected the reputation of the imperial family. With the personal name, she could be counted as half an imperial family member. If she claimed to be poor, then it would be the same as claiming that the imperial family was poor, disgracing the imperial family. Chu Lian looked more carefully at this ninth sister of hers. She hadn't expected a 13-year-old child to be trying such plots already. How was Miss Fu so confident that she would just take this lying down? Miss Yuan's gaze was fixed on that golden hairpin. It was made with fine detail, and the 3 similarly sized emeralds at the top of the hairpin were pretty. Under the lamplight, it would probably shine even more. When she thought of how this beautiful hairpin would soon be hers without having to spend a single coin, and how angry Chu Lian would be in the process of paying for it, her heart was filled with joy. Thus, Miss Yuan helped to further the ploy. Fifth sister, don't forget. It's not the same as before. Sixth sister is the honored Lady Jeannie now. Although Miss Su wanted to protect Chu Lian, the two younger sisters were collaborating against them, so she couldn't even think of a rebuttal. Finally, she could only look at Chu Lien apologetically. Chu Lien returned a troubled smile to her. Without saying whether she could afford to buy these accessories, she turned to the manager standing by the side to ask, "Manager, are there other designs? Take them out to show me." Miss Fu was delighted by Chu Lien's increasingly troubled expression. She didn't care whether Chu Lien would buy that bracelet for her or not. All she wanted was to make Chu Lien lose face and fall in disgrace. She wanted her to know that it wasn't easy to keep that noble title of hers. Once the news that Chu Lien had disgraced the imperial family's name spread out, someone would definitely pass it on to the emperor or empress. By then, before she could even settle down with her noble title, it would probably be taken back. Chu Lien would become the joke of the capital then. Chapter 177, Gifting a Jade Bangle, 1. This chapter has been stolen from LoveLore novels. Please read from the original source. The female manager made a sound of agreement and quickly brought back quite a few sets of jewelry with the help of a maidservant. She placed them all in front of Chu Lien, one by one. This time, the accessories that the manager brought over were cheaper than the previous 3. The moment Chu Lien picked up a gold ring and glanced over it, she realized these new accessories couldn't compare to the 3 that the Hao Xing sisters had chosen. Without exposing the manager's actions, she gently set the gold ring back down. However, Chu Lien didn't continue browsing through the new selection. Instead, she stood up and walked over to the counter. Everyone else exchanged glances. Even the manager didn't know what this plainly dressed honored Lady Genie was thinking. It wasn't until Chu Lien's soft voice rang out again that the manager regained her senses. "Manager, take these jade rings out. I'd like to have a look at them." The manager quickly strode over to the counter and slipped behind it. When she saw exactly what Chu Lien was pointing at, she was rendered speechless. The manager recovered a moment later. She swiftly removed the exquisite wooden box and laid it out for Chu Lien. Chu Lien had pointed to a pair of green Hitian jade thumb rings. One was larger while the other was smaller. It was clear that they formed a matching set. Green Hitian jade was a prized type of jade. Whatever the form, it was viewed as extremely valuable. Wearing rings on the thumb had not yet come into fashion in the Great Wu dynasty. In court, only military officials would wear rings on their thumbs, which helped in drawing bows. When Jinshi Pavilion had received this piece of Hitian jade back then, they hadn't planned on making thumb rings out of them. Unfortunately, there was a flaw in the raw material, so after much consideration by the master craftsmen, they decided to make a pair anyway. It was the best usage for that particular piece of jade they had. However, not many people were interested in buying thumb rings, so the customers had always passed over this pair, until now. Thus, Chu Lien ended up reaping the benefits today. This exact pair of green Hitian jade thumb rings had appeared in the original story as well. Chu Lien had also chanced upon this set of rings, though it hadn't been at Jinshi Pavilion, and she had also bought them. The larger ring that was clearly sized for a man had ended up on Xiao Bojian's hand. Xiao Bojian had been a literary official. It was thanks to his wearing of this green jade thumb ring that thumb rings turned into a status symbol and a fashion trend. When held in hand, the Hitian jade rings felt slightly warm to the touch. The jade was of extremely high quality, its luster and color were top-notch. The smaller ring seemed to have been made for Chu Lien. When she put it on her thumb, the vibrant green of the jade complemented her fair fingers. It was beautiful. Even the ladies from Hao Xing were a little dazed from the sight. They had never thought that an accessory that only Russian military men wore could look this good on a woman's hand. If it was matched by a full set of riding clothes, then the effect would be greatly magnified. Chu Lien was satisfied, of course. She looked at the manager and indicated with her eyes that she would like an explanation about the rings. After the manager got over her surprise, she calmed down and stated, "Madam, this one doesn't dare to hide anything from you. What you're holding now is a pair of thumb rings. It's made from the highest quality green Hitian jade. The amount of jade we received back then was limited, so all we could make was these. But hardly anyone is interested in buying thumb rings. They've been on display for quite some time now without any buyers. If Madam would truly like to buy these, this one will take the initiative and make an offer of 300 taels of silver for you. Is this agreeable to you?" Chu Lian nodded as she listened. It was the same as the novel. This pair of rings was much cheaper than normal Hitian jade accessories, as expected. Jinshi Pavilion's manager was rather honest and had given her a fair price for them. However, 300 taels wasn't a small sum either. Chu Lian didn't make any mention of buying them, but she didn't let the manager put the rings away. Instead, she took a look at some other accessories. Miss Fu was right behind Chu Lian. At an angle where no one could see, she sneered as she thought, "If you can't afford it, why bother asking at all? Does she think that she can buy some time and wait for someone to pay up for her instead?" Miss Yuan was also starting to become impatient. "Sixth sister, after looking at so many accessories, are you finally done browsing?" Chu Lian turned to glance at her. She set down the orchid-shaped jade hairpin in her hands and actually pulled out a smile for Miss Yuan. "Is anything the matter? It seems like eighth sister is more anxious than I am." Without waiting for Miss Yuan's angry rebuttal, Miss Fu took the initiative to speak up next. Her smile concealed a certain hidden meaning as she said, "Sixth sister, you couldn't have possibly left your house in such a hurry that you forgot to bring any money with you, right? It's all right, we can forego those accessories." Miss Su was angered. "Eighth sister, ninth sister. That's enough from you too." Miss Fu was keeping a close eye on Chu Lian's expression. Although Chu Lian seemed calm on the surface, there was a hint of panic in her almond-shaped eyes. Thus, Miss Fu was satisfied by the effect of her provocation. She was inwardly thinking, "Let's see how she tries to recover from this now." The manager maintained her silence and secretly peeked at Chu Lian. She didn't really believe that the plainly dressed Chu Lian had more than 1,000 taels to spend on these accessories. Chu Lian looked at Miss Su and reassured her. "Fifth sister, there's no need to worry. I think that jade bangle is a good choice. It will look good on you." Then, she turned and shot a look at Miss Yuan and Miss Fu. A bright spark shone in her black eyes. The sudden difference in her expression made Miss Yuan and Miss Fu uneasy for a moment. They couldn't speak. The traces of reluctance and worry had completely disappeared from Chu Lian's eyes. Instead, they shone bright with humor and cunning, as brilliant as the stars in the night sky. She turned to face the stunned manager and said, "Manager, please pack up the 3 accessories that these ladies picked out just now and this pair of thumb rings. Wenqing, follow the manager and settle the bill." Chapter 178, Gifting a Jade Bangle, 2. This chapter has been stolen from LoveLore novels. Please read from the original source. Chu Lian had already looked around at the other accessories in Jinshi Pavilion. Although their workmanship and material were high quality, their designs were old and simple. There weren't many fresh designs in the lot either. It would be much better if she made a design herself and gave it to a master craftsman at Jinshi Pavilion to craft for her. The manager had thought that she couldn't afford a single accessory at all. Who could have expected that she would be so generous when the time came? She actually bought the set of rings she had taken a liking to, as well as all the accessories the 3 ladies had picked. Altogether, that was a purchase of 600 taels of silver. This was a huge sale. The manager smiled widely from ear to ear and said, "Since Madam is buying all these accessories, this one will take the initiative to round off the final figure to 600 taels. Of course, the pair of jade earrings this one offered for free earlier will be counted in." Hearing this, Wenqing took out 600 taels worth of banknotes from her purse and passed it over to the manager. After the manager checked the banknotes, she took care to pack up the accessories properly in their wooden boxes, and passed these over to Wenqing and Wenlan. Chu Lian smiled until her almond-shaped eyes turned into upturned crescents as she looked at the three ladies. The three sisters from Housing couldn't hide the shock on their faces. However, there were different nuances to their shock. Miss Su's face carried a trace of concern, while Miss Yuan's smile was full of the secret delight taken in an unexpected windfall. Meanwhile, Miss Fu was showing resentment and dissatisfaction from not seeing her plots come to fruition. Miss Fu sourly remarked, "Sixth sister has really changed her fortune since getting that noble title. I've really broadened my horizons today." This time, Chu Lian didn't remain quiet and looked right at Miss Fu with a broad smile. "Thank you for your praise, ninth sister." Miss Fu was so choked by those words that she couldn't even maintain the fake expression on her face. A hint of her unhappiness shone through. Miss Yuan's gaze darted to the boxes that Wenlan was carrying. She hated that she couldn't take that emerald hairpin she wanted immediately. Only Miss Su followed behind Chu Lian and watched her with concern, worried that she had spent too much of her money after getting provoked just now. After buying the accessories, Chu Lian didn't want to stay in Jinshi Pavilion any longer. The four ladies of Housing were escorted to Jinshi Pavilion's entrance by the manager. When they reached the place where Chu Lian's carriage had stopped, she paused and turned. She took one of the boxes from Wenlan and gave it to Miss Su, who was right behind her. "Fifth sister, this is the jade bangle you wanted. Take it." Miss Su rejected it and shook her head. "Sixth sister, this bangle is too expensive, I can't take it. You should bring it home with you to wear." Miss Su had never expected nor wanted Chu Lian to give her that jade bangle at all. Chu Lian glared at her playfully and shoved the jade bangle into her hands. "Fifth sister, this jade bangle doesn't suit me at all. It'll be useless if I bring it home with me." She even showed her wrists to Miss Su. Chu Lian's wrists were much more slender than Miss Su's, so the jade bangle really didn't suit her. Miss Yuan's eyes were wide open and her heart was filled with anxiety as she watched the two of them politely passing the box here and there. She really wanted to help Miss Su accept the gift, so that Miss Su's rejection wouldn't affect the likelihood of Chu Lian giving her the golden hairpin. When Miss Su finally accepted that jade bangle, she heaved a sigh of relief. Miss Yuan's gaze immediately locked onto Chu Lian next. Miss Su had no other choice but to accept the bangle. She felt guilty and happy at the same time. Chu Lian's willingness to give her something meant that the relationship between them could still be repaired. "Then I'll thank sixth sister here. The next time I have something good in my hands, I'll definitely think of sixth sister first." Chu Lian smiled at her and patted the back of her hand. Next, she set her eyes on Miss Yuan and Miss Fu. Miss Yuan was staring at her with an almost frenzied gaze, while Miss Fu had been going around with an ugly expression since getting slapped in the face by her actions in Jinshi Pavilion. She couldn't even be bothered to fake a pleasant smile, and instead, pursed her lips without speaking. Chu Lian inwardly rolled her eyes. Miss Fu was still expecting a gift from her even in this state. Did Miss Fu really think that she was a saint or something? Chu Lian looked away from them and looked to Miss Su instead. With a warm expression, she said, "Fifth sister, it's getting late now. It's about time for me to head home. Let's say our goodbyes here. I'll send you an invite for a flower appreciation party at the Jing'an estate some other time." Miss Su smiled and nodded. Goodbyes done, Chu Lien immediately turned to her carriage, leaving a slender silhouette for Miss Fu and the others to gaze upon. Miss Yuan was momentarily stunned. Without even thinking, she reached out her hand towards Chu Lien as if she wanted to bring her back. When Miss Yuan recovered her wits, she couldn't help but chase after her. Sixth sister, wait. Chu Lien stopped and turned around. She blinked innocently and tilted her head to one side in mock confusion. Eighth sister, is there something the matter? Miss Yuan pressed her lips together, her eyes full of disbelief. She actually forgot her golden hairpin. How could she do that? She had picked that golden hairpin first. It should be hers. Miss Yuan exercised the last of her restraint to hold back the unhappiness and frustration in her heart and managed to squeeze out a slightly strained smile. She tried to remind Chu Lien by saying, Sixth sister, have you forgotten something? Chu Lien looked upwards, as if she was giving a serious amount of thought to this question. After a moment, she smiled as she met Miss Yuan's expectant gaze and shook her head. My memory's still good. I remembered everything important, and didn't forget anything. What? Miss Yuan's eyes widened and her hands curled into fists under her sleeves. She angrily said, since sixth sister can't remember, then I'll remind sixth sister. That golden hairpin. Chapter 179, Who Said It's For You? 1. This chapter has been stolen from LoveLore novels. Please read from the original source. Chu Lien acted as if she had just realized what was going on. Oh, does eighth sister mean that golden hairpin I just bought from Jinshi Pavilion? What's wrong with it? When Miss Yuan saw that Chu Lien was still pretending to have forgotten about their deal, she wanted to charge right up to Wenlan and take the golden hairpin out of her hands. I was the one who chose that hairpin. Chu Lien nodded. That's right, eighth sister did choose that golden hairpin. To Miss Yuan, Chu Lien admitting this fact was the equivalent of a box of tinder res sparking the flame of hope in her eyes. But her next words left Miss Yuan utterly dumbfounded. However, I was the one who paid for it. Does eighth sister think that anything you take a liking to is automatically yours? Aren't you too naive? This statement completely blindsided her. Although Miss Yuan now knew there wasn't much of a chance that she would get that golden hairpin from Chu Lien, she continued to argue anyway. But you gave that jade bangle to fifth sister. So I did. But I never thought of giving the golden hairpin to you. Did you ever hear me say anything like that? Chu Lien threw down her final words and turned to walk towards her carriage. Now that her back was facing those three sisters of Hao Xing, she couldn't resist showing a mischievous smile. Wenqing and Wenlan felt just as refreshed from that scene. Their hearts were filled with the deepest admiration for their master. What great face-slapping skills their master had. What a delight. This outcome was out of Miss Fu's expectations. She stood rooted to the spot, too stunned from the sudden twist of events to move. It took her a long time to recover. Miss Yuan's eyes were filled with tears. How could Chu Lien do this to her? How could she be so shameless? That golden hairpin should be hers. The Hao Xing sisters' trap was too obvious. From the very beginning, Chu Lien had never intended to let their scheme succeed. Buying all the jewelry they had picked out. Part of the plan. Giving Miss Su the jade bangle. Also part of her plan, to make the other two think she had indeed bought those accessories for them. However, Chu Lien had intentionally never once said that she was going to give them to them. Buying the accessories was one thing. Whether she was going to give them to them was a whole other matter. For a moment, Miss Su watched Chu Lien's back as she departed. Then, she turned her gaze back onto Miss Yuan and Miss Fu, and with a sneer, she said to them, "It's getting late. We should be going home, too." Going home. I don't want to go home. I want that golden hairpin. In her rage, Miss Yuan began to throw a childish tantrum. Since you want it so much, go back to Jinshi Pavilion with 150 tails and you'll have one. Miss Su was done being polite. While she had a kind personality, she wasn't someone to be bullied. Miss Yuan wasn't from the same family branch anyway, so she didn't have any reason to give in to her whining. Miss Yuan felt very aggrieved. Tears fell one by one from her eyes, shining like pearls. She had been spoiled rotten by second madam, so though she was already 14 this year, her attitude was still careless and thoughtless. The moment things didn't go her way, she would throw a tantrum. Even her handmaid was embarrassed for her. Miss Yuan looked around for someone she could childishly badger until they gave in, like back at home, but Miss Su and Miss Fu simply looked at her with disdain. However, by looking at her surroundings, she actually found someone she could use her charms on. Not too far off, a middle-aged man was walking in their direction with a manservant behind him. Who else could it be but the second master of Housing, Chu Qijing? The moment Miss Yuan caught sight of Chu Qijing, she dashed over and hugged him. Daddy! Upon leaving the Pan estate, Chu Qijing had bumped into House Ying's two young masters on the street. He had heard from them that the three young ladies were at Jinshi Pavilion and thus, had rushed over. When he looked down and saw that his daughter's nose was red and her face was covered in the tear tracks, Chu Qijing frowned. Who had dared to bully his daughter? He tenderly patted her hair and said, "What happened to our little Yuan? Why are you so sad?" "Daddy. Sixth sister stole my golden hairpin. I was clearly the one who picked it out." Miss Yuan's voice softened as she complained to her father. Chu Qijing's brows furrowed together even more. Chu Lian. Miss Su was about to explain when Miss Fu pulled her away. Miss Fu lowered her voice and whispered into Miss Su's ear, "Fifth sister, it's best if you don't bother with the second branch's family matters. Beware of biting off more than you can chew." Miss Su hesitated for a moment but ultimately chose to keep silent. This second uncle of hers was known for being headstrong. Even if she tried to cut in, he probably wouldn't listen to her. Miss Yuan had finally found someone she could depend on. She looked up at Chu Qijing with her teary eyes and pointed in the direction that Chu Lian had left in. At this moment, Chu Lian had just walked up to her carriage. Wen Lan had retrieved a small stool from inside the carriage and was preparing to help Chu Lian up. Chu Qijing didn't have any male heirs, and he only had a single daughter left with him in the Yingguo estate. He had spoiled his second daughter like a pearl in the palm of his hand since she was young. Of course he was going to help rectify this injustice she had suffered. Thus, he strode towards Chu Lian together with Chu Yuan, even though he had only heard just a few words from his daughter. Right before she could get into her carriage, Chu Lian noticed her father walking towards her from the corners of her eyes. Thus, she stopped moving and stood by the carriage, brows slightly drawn together as Chu Qijing came closer. When he was close enough, Chu Lian made a slight bow and gave a proper greeting to Chu Qijing. "Does father have any urgent business with me?" Chu Qijing's features were pretty good for his age, and he might even be considered a suave middle-aged uncle. What a pity that he was currently frowning with a serious, unhappy expression. It utterly spoiled his natural good looks. He didn't bother beating around the bush with Chu Lian and simply stated, "Return that golden hairpin to your sister. Your sister said that it's hers. As her older sister, you should give in to your younger sister." If she wasn't sure that she was a legitimate daughter of Housing, Chu Lian might have suspected that she wasn't of his blood. He was the father of both of them, but Chu Qijing's heart was clearly too biased towards one daughter. Luckily she wasn't the original Chu Lian, and Chu Qijing was simply some middle-aged stranger she had met a few times. If she really took him as her father, wouldn't she choke to death based on his words alone? Chapter 180, Who Said It's For You? 2. This chapter has been stolen from LoveLore novels. Please read from the original source. Now that she had someone to back her up, Miss Yuan looked at Chu Lian in delight, flaunting her power. Chu Lian was too lazy to argue with this brain-dead pair of father and daughter. She rolled her eyes with an exaggerated motion, without any care for her image. She then snorted and said, "Daddy, why did you come to interrogate me without first making sure of the truth? Those not in the know might even think that I'm not really your daughter." Chu Qijing glared at her in disbelief that she would say such words. His rage shot through the roof and he was about to vent his temper and give her a sound scolding. However, Chu Lian didn't give him the chance. "Next time, I hope Daddy can investigate the truth properly before coming to interrogate your daughter. Don't just place all the blame on me without any proof. My husband isn't around and I'm alone, so I can't withstand your accusations. It was me who bought that golden hairpin you mentioned. 150 taels, no more, no less. If you don't believe me, you can ask the manager over at Jinshi Pavilion. If 8th sister likes it, Daddy can buy one for 8th sister there. I'm sure that Daddy won't be bothered about spending such a trivial sum of money since you're such a great and mighty man." Chu Lian didn't continue any further. She boarded her carriage by herself. With a crack of the driver's whip, Chu Lian's carriage departed with the escort of her family servants, disappearing from Chu Qijing's sight. Chu Qijing only knew Chu Lian as the daughter who sometimes craved for his approval. He hadn't expected her to completely abandon all consideration for his pride. She had disgraced him without a second thought. His face was as black as a pot. However, he couldn't find anything wrong with what Chu Lian had said either. Finally, he could only hold back his anger and question Miss Yuan. "Is what your 6th sister said true?" Miss Yuan knew that her plot had failed again, so she harumphed and said, "6th sister bought that golden hairpin, but I was clearly the one who chose it first." As she spoke, she started to cry. She looked up at Chu Qijing with a pitiful expression. "Daddy, I really like that golden hairpin. Maybe Daddy can buy a hairpin for little Yuan." Buying a hairpin. Chu Qijing's face froze. Second Madam was strictly in charge of the finances at home, and he didn't have much squared away in his private funds. He usually went out to play, drink, and have fun. How could he possibly have 100 taels to buy a hairpin? What a dangerous thought that Miss Yuan had. Nonsense. Stop thinking about buying this and that. All you know how to do is spend money on accessories. Girls your age should be doing more productive things, like focusing on your studies. Chu Qijing tossed his sleeves and left. Due to Chu Lian's words, his chest was full of rage. When Miss Yuan saw that her plan hadn't come to fruition, she wiped her tears with a handkerchief and looked down with reddened eyes. Her heart was full of hate for Chu Lian. Miss Fu and Miss Su were watching from afar. Miss Fu's lips curled up and she mocked, "Ever since 6th sister got married, she's been getting more and more difficult to deal with." However, Miss Su didn't share her thoughts. If only she could be as straightforward and decisive as 6th sister was. On the way back to the Jing'an estate, Chu Lian leaned against the wall and rested her eyes for a while. Wenqing and Wenlan sat to one side and carefully watched her expression. Finally, Wenqing couldn't hold back any longer and began to try to console her. "Third young madam, please don't think too much about what just happened. You're now a member of House Jing'an. You have third young master, madam, and the matriarch." Hearing this, Chu Lian opened her eyes to look at Wenqing. She suddenly smiled and reached out to pinch Wenqing's nose. "You silly girl, what are you thinking about? I'm not angry." Her mother-in-law and grandmother-in-law both treated her very well. Chu Lian was already satisfied. As for that crazy, absentee husband of hers, forget it. She had never thought of expecting anything from him. When Wenqing saw that Chu Lian's smile seemed to be genuine and she really wasn't bothered by what happened just now, she heaved a sigh of relief together with Wenlan. Following that, she purposely tried to cheer her master up with a couple jokes. Chu Lian rolled her eyes. "Alright, enough. Your jokes aren't funny at all." Wenqing covered her smile with a hand. "If third young madam has any funnier jokes, then why don't you share them with us servants?" Chu Lian coughed once for effect. "Then listen carefully." Wenqing and Wenlan nodded seriously. Chu Lian coughed again into her fist before sending a sneaky glance at Wenqing and Wenlan with wide, watery eyes. "If a fatty jumps from a 9-story pagoda, what will he turn into?" Wenqing and Wenlan thought long and hard, and gave all sorts of guesses. They even tried guessing the god, but Chu Lian still shook her head. Wenqing was burning with curiosity since she couldn't guess the answer. With a coquettish lilt, she pleaded, "Third young madam, please tell us the answer. What will he turn into?" Dead serious, Chu Lian stated the answer without a single break in her expression. "What else could it be?" "He'd turn into a dead fatty, of course. What kind of human can survive a fall from a 9-story tall pagoda?" Upon hearing the final answer, Wenqing and Wenlan looked like they just ate a mouthful of flies. Their mouths opened and closed, but in the end, they couldn't manage to say anything. From then on, the two maidservants never asked third young madam for a joke ever again. Her jokes were way too lame. They weren't funny at all. Sob, sob, sob. When she saw Wenqing and Wenlan's expressions, Chu Lian couldn't restrain herself any longer and fell back laughing inside the carriage. Although her maiden family didn't love her and her husband wasn't interested in her, at least her handmaids were all really cute. With these sisters by her side, she didn't feel the slightest bit lonely at all. TL note: I closed submissions for the messages for TMR's author. I'm going to be compiling all the messages and translating some of the best ones so she'll be able to understand them all. For those who gave permission, your messages will be posted on Volari to share with everyone. Thanks for participating. Love. Chapter 181, Having Meat in the Army, 1. This chapter has been stolen from LoveLore novels. Please read from the original source. The capital was currently in early autumn, signaling the arrival of the strong winds that would blow and disturb the people's daily lives every once in a while. On the other hand, the northern border, specifically the city of Liangzhou, was already in the early stages of a desolate winter. The roaming nomads had already stopped grazing their herds. They set up tents instead, storing up food to pass their winter. In the army camp just 5 kilometers away from Liangzhou, other than handling their normal daily chores, the army was still training for battle. Smoke was rising from the cookhouse in the camp. It was already time for dinner. The setting sun hung at the boundary of the horizon, casting its red light over the wide, vast plains, breathing additional color into the scenery. However, no matter how vibrant and warm the colors, they couldn't erase the cold, piercing winter winds that blew over the plains at this time of year. A crisp, loud signal began to ring throughout the camp, transmitted to every nook and cranny. The moment the last section of training on the grounds ended, there was a roar of male voices as the captains shouted to begin eating. Even though it was the start of winter, the northern border troops were on standby, so they only got to eat 2 meals a day. One in the morning and one at night. After training for the whole day and getting drenched in sweat, the troops were so hungry that they could eat a horse each. When the captain gave the order, they dashed towards the cookhouse at a speed that even the general's fastest shot couldn't match. In Captain Guo's camp, more than 300 elite soldiers charged towards the cookhouse like hungry wolves. The tall, burly Captain Guo followed behind his soldiers. His tanned face carried a smile as he mock-scolded his speedy troops. Two men followed behind Captain Guo. The one on the left was sturdy, and even taller than Captain Guo by a full head. His eyes were like deep pools and his nose was tall and straight. He looked to be about 20 or so. However, his good looks were obscured by a thick, full beard covering half of his face. What a pity. The man on the right was about as tall as Captain Guo. He was clean-shaven, but his face was too square and his eyes were too small. Furthermore, his body was about one size bigger than Captain Guo's, so he wasn't as good-looking as his companion. However, this burly, square-faced man seemed to be rather young as well. Captain Guo patted the backs of the two people next to him. Zixiang, Yuhong, you should manage these brats carefully. They're too rowdy. Zixiang was He Changdi's name, while Yuhong was the burly square-faced man, of course. Due to Count Jing'an and Prince Jin's influence, although this was He Changdi's first time serving in the northern border troops under Captain Guo, he was able to start off a little higher than the rest thanks to his status. He had managed to join as a lieutenant. In the Great Wu dynasty, the rank of lieutenant meant that he had a small group of about 100 men or so under his command. Captain Guo had 3 lieutenants serving under him. Other than He Changdi and Xiao Yuhong, there was also a man in his 30s, Zhang Mai. He Changdi and Xiao Yuhong quickly chuckled and agreed with the captain. When Captain Guo saw that they had already started fighting over the food over at the cookhouse, he quickened his pace. Let's move a little faster before those hungry brats eat up all of our food. Captain Guo was only joking. The army cooks would always keep his and his 3 lieutenants' meals aside. But even with this little courtesy, Captain Guo treated his soldiers like brothers. His meals were exactly the same fare as what the troops ate, although his portions might be a little larger. He was an upright, honest person who never ordered any separate or special meals from the army cooks. The only time he had ever eaten something different from the troops was when he had insisted on leading their training even while he was sick. The old army cook hadn't been able to bear with seeing this, so he had specially made some wild chicken soup for him. That had already been a whole year ago. However, the northern border was a poor place to be anyway. Although the troops were regularly given provisions and money, there was still a limit to the circulation of goods in this place. The army provisions were also rough fare. When they weren't preparing for battle, it was only enough to fill the stomachs. Even if Captain Guo wanted to have something better, there wasn't really much else to eat. Chapter 182, Having Meat in the Army, 2. When the 3 of them reached the cookhouse, the old army cook quickly brought out 3 large porcelain bowls and placed them on a small wooden table, which had 4 wooden stools placed around it. It was still dusk. Under the cover of the tent flap, which blocked the wind from reaching them, they could use the fading light to have a rough meal of army fare. Captain Guo had his 2 assistants sit down first before pointing at the 3 bowls on the table. It's been a tiring day, let's just eat. He Changdi and Xiao Yuhong didn't stand on courtesy and picked up some chopsticks to begin wolfing down their food. Today's dinner was Chinese olive porridge with some cabbage thrown in. There were 2 wheat pancakes thrown on top of the porridge and no meat. The porridge itself was simply flavored with a little bit of coarse salt. Since it was the lowest quality of salt, there was a strange taste to it as well. With this kind of food, they couldn't be picky about the taste. They could only use it to fill their stomachs out of a lack of better options. Xiao Yuhong finished off a wheat pancake in 2 or 3 bites. When he tried to swallow it down, it got stuck in his throat. He had to gulp down quite a few mouthfuls of the porridge before he could push that piece of pancake down into his stomach. His face was flushed red from the exertion, and he stared into his bowl in a daze. Although he looked as strong as a bull, he was younger than He Changdi by a year at only 19 years old. He had joined the army just last year, and his family was also a military official house. Although his family had been strict with his education, he had never lacked for any sort of food ever since he was young. Brother Gua, brother He, at every mealtime, I really miss eating the meat that my mother cooked. Back at home, I still thought that meat was too fatty and oily. If I could have a whole pot of it now, I'd finish it all up and lick it clean. Captain Gua found it funny and pointed at his bowl. What's wrong? You still have half your bowl left. If you can't finish it, give it to me, it'll help you eat it up. Xiao Yuhong quickly pulled his bowl into a protective embrace, just like a little puppy trying to protect its food. The others couldn't hold back their laughter at the sight. No way. Brother Gua, I'm not done yet. Humph. Didn't you say you wanted to eat meat? But there isn't any. If there was meat, who would eat this porridge or these pancakes? He Changdi held his bowl and slowly ate his meal. Although he ate pretty quickly, he didn't look like a starving wolf at all, and even seemed to have an elegant grace in his actions. It was just his beard that seemed a little inconvenient. Some porridge would get on it from time to time. He Changdi simply buried his head and ate his meal, acting deaf to the conversation of the two people beside him. Right after Captain Gua and Xiao Yuhong finished talking, a man's voice joined in, easy like a refreshing breeze. Who says there's no meat? What? There's meat. Xiao Yuhong immediately stood up, his eyes almost shining red from his hunger. He hadn't had a bite of meat for months now. Thanks to his excitement, his small eyes had grown wide. The man who spoke walked over with an empty bowl. He was about as tall as He Changdi, but without a beard on his face. He was also wearing a lieutenant's uniform, but he was clearly older than He Changdi by a whole decade. He was the third lieutenant under Captain Gua's command, Zhang Mai. Zhang Mai had been exempted from training today due to an old wound flaring up. After resting in his tent for half the day, he had wandered over to the cookhouse for dinner. For some reason, the previously silent He Changdi suddenly froze. Xiao Yuhong was practically drooling from the thought of having meat to eat. He quickly moved over to Zhang Mai, face sticking out as if he could smell the meat. He pleaded in a friendly tone, "Brother Zhang, you just said that there's meat to eat. You can't forget about your brother here." Zhang Mai smiled mysteriously before reaching out with one finger and pointing at the now rigid He Changdi. Chapter 183, Having Meat in the Army, 3. This chapter has been stolen from LoveLore Novels. Please read from the original source. Both Xiao Yuhong and Captain Gua's gazes turned in unison to He Changdi. He Changdi looked up with a stiff expression. His deep eyes drew their attention, but screamed his innocence. Zhang Mai awkwardly coughed into his fist. Embarrassed, he said, "Captain, I was a little too hasty with my words. The meat I mentioned was something that Zixiang's wife sent to him via messenger. Life was tough out here in the border troops. Even a captain wouldn't be able to eat meat more than once a month out here. If someone wanted some, they would have to hunt it themselves out in the plains, and that was only when they were on a rare vacation. However, with the arrival of winter, the animals were all in hibernation. It was getting harder and harder to find anything to hunt. Suffering from meat withdrawal was an all too common problem out here amongst the northern border troops. The troops did not maintain contact with the Tuhin or the nomadic barbarians, and they didn't raise any livestock in their camp either. The amount of meat available to them was pitiful. Zhang Mai shared a tent with He Changdi, and usually took good care of his junior. Big brother Zhang was older than He Changdi by a whole decade, and had already been in the army for about that long as well. He had participated in countless battles and was Captain Gua's most trusted subordinate. He had much experience to share, but his years in the army had left old wounds on his body, so his health wasn't as good as the others. Furthermore, Liangzhou had just entered winter. After sweating it out on the training grounds and getting hit by a blast of cold wind, coupled with the aching of his old wounds because of the chill, Zhang Mai had caught a cold. It had unfortunately manifested in a high fever, leaving him bedridden. The old doctor in camp had come over to take a look. All he had done was some acupuncture, and then had prescribed some medicine. As for food and water, that was all left to the patient's means to supply. When Captain Gua was notified of his situation, he ordered the army cooks to send a pot of white rice porridge to Zhang Mai. Captain Gua had had nothing better to offer. Since Changdi shared a tent with Zhang Mai, he took up the responsibility of caring for him. As he watched Zhang Mai grow ever paler and skinnier due to his illness and old wounds, Changdi quietly took out the translucent shredded beef that Chu Lian had sent to him. He scooped some out of the jar and placed it into Zhang Mai's porridge. When the bedridden Zhang Mai saw the shredded beef covered in oil sitting on top of his usually plain porridge, his eyes went completely wide. Zhang Mai didn't stand on courtesy with Yi Sanlang, and quickly wolfed down his porridge in only a few big gulps. After he was done, he wiped his mouth and pointed at the bowl, asking with surprise, "Where did that come from?" The normally taciturn Yi Sanlang then said, "My wife sent it over." Zhang Mai laughed out loud, which only ended up making him cough. "Since your wife sent it to you, you must have eaten much of it in the past. Why don't you leave the rest of it for your big brother here? It'll be good for my recovery." Although Yi Sanlang looked calm and composed, Zhang Mai still hadn't expected him to be such a tough nut to crack. Yi Sanlang refused to answer him. In the end, he only gave Zhang Mai that shredded beef a few more times. When Zhang Mai had recovered, he had searched through every nook and cranny of that tent, but it was pointless. He couldn't find where Changdi had hidden that little jar of translucent shredded beef. Zhang Mai could only shake his head and smile. When he had overheard that Kid Xiao Yuhong talking about eating meat, Zhang Mai had simply mentioned Changdi's store of meat casually. Although Captain Guo raised his troops with love, he trained them very strictly. He might seem coarse and open-hearted on the surface, but he actually wasn't too easy to get close to. Zhang Mai had been serving under this superior officer of his for many years, so he understood him a lot more than Xiao Yuhong and Changdi did. Right now, though Captain Guo called these two kids his brothers, they weren't all that important to him on the inside. In order to soften the steel walls of Captain Guo's heart, some small tricks were needed. For example, this small matter of eating meat. Zhang Mai had seen Changdi's ability. He came from a good background and had proven that he had both ambition and the talent to back it. He was also a good kid inside. Unfortunately, perhaps since it was his first time in the army, he still fell a little short when it came to interacting with others. Zhang Mai didn't know why, but he guessed that it might have been due to how he grew up when he was a child. That kid liked to keep a blank expression, although half of it was usually hidden by his full beard. It was inevitable that the combination of Changdi's appearance and attitude would give a bad first impression. When he had first started interacting with Changdi, Zhang Mai hadn't really liked him. He had toiled for 10 years to get to this position of lieutenant, while Changdi had gotten in just by a letter from Prince Jin. However, after interacting with him more, he had slowly began to approve of this young man. When he had fallen sick, Changdi had taken very good care of him despite his cold expression. From his clumsy actions, Zhang Mai could tell that Changdi had never really taken care of someone before. It was then that Zhang Mai had set down his initial misgivings and fully accepted this junior of his. He had come out now with the intention of helping Changdi out. Xiao Yuhong's eyes were alight. He quickly moved up to Changdi and stared at him with wide eyes. "Brother He, you really have meat." Although he spoke with some degree of yearning, he didn't ask for it outright. Still, Xiao Yuhong's desire was visible, his drool was about to drip out of his mouth. Captain Guo didn't press Changdi at all. Instead, he continued eating the hard wheat pancake in his bowl. He looked up with a smile and shot Changdi a glance. Zhang Mai was starting to regret trying to help this blockhead out, seeing as he hadn't realized what he was supposed to do. He kicked the wooden stool under Changdi and said, "You stupid brat, what are you blanking out here for? It's just something your wife sent you." It's fine if you couldn't bear to let me eat it, but now you're even refusing to serve it to the captain. Changdi pressed his lips together and stood up. He bowed respectfully towards Captain Gua and said, "Please wait for a moment, Captain." Changdi returned soon enough carrying a small jar. He placed it on the table and opened the lid. The unique smell of pickled beef drifted out and filled the room. "Captain, it's all here now. Please try it." Changdi ordered someone to bring another bowl. He poured the remaining half of the translucent shredded beef into it. Chapter 184, Having Meat in the Army, 4. This chapter has been stolen from LoveLore novels. Please read from the original source. Captain Gua used his chopsticks to pick some up, and took an experimental bite. After savoring the taste, his eyes lit up and he praised, "It's good. Sister-in-law must be a really good cook." After saying so, he used his chopsticks to point at Changdi. "You lucky brat, you married a good wife. You were crazy enough to come all the way out here to the northern border, but not only did your wife not blame you, she even sent you something good to eat. I heard that you came out here just a few days after getting married, too." Xiao Yuhong hadn't heard of this news. He had been intently listening to this juicy piece of gossip while shoveling the shredded beef into his mouth, and didn't even bother to swallow before noisily asking, "Brother what's wrong? Is sister-in-law not pretty enough for you?" Captain Gua harumphed. "Not pretty. So what if she's not pretty? As long as she can manage the household and give birth to a few sons, she's a good wife. Besides, I heard that he married a legitimate daughter from Hao Xing." When Xiao Yuhong received a sudden warning glare from Zhang Mai, he abruptly came to a realization. The captain's wife was an ugly woman, but was deeply respected by the captain. She had also given birth to a fair amount of good sons and daughters for him. Xiao Yuhong came from a common family, but he still knew this much from listening to his mother and sister's gossip sessions from before. That was also why he knew that, although Hao Xing was on the decline, their ladies had the reputation of being exceptionally fertile. Furthermore, their looks were all top-notch. His wife was most likely not the reason that brother he had left his home in such a hurry. Xiao Yuhong knew that he had stepped on a landmine with his careless words, so he stopped talking and buried his head in his bowl of meat. From the side, Zhang Mai tried to smooth the dispute over. "Captain's right. In the future when we return to the capital, we definitely have to go to the captain's estate and visit sister-in-law." It was only then that Captain Guo was satisfied. He continued pointing at Changdi as he lectured him. "Since you've come out already and you can't disobey army orders, you won't be able to return home for quite some time. Still, you can't keep your head in the sand. You left a young wife back at home, you heartless bastard. She's living like a widow, but she hasn't forgotten to send you packages even with how you've treated her. If you have time, make sure you send more letters back home. And when you have the money, don't forget to buy some local specialties and send them back to your wife and family." Compared to how he usually addressed his brothers on the training grounds, there was an additional trace of sincerity in Captain Guo's tone. The way he was pointing out Changdi's wrongs seemed more like an older brother earnestly lecturing a younger family member for their own good. Zhang Mai's smile widened a little upon hearing this. Changdi also stopped being a block of wood and immediately stood up to bow deeply towards Captain Gua in thanks for his teachings. He could also feel that he had become much closer to Captain Gua thanks to this small jar of translucent shredded beef. Changdi stared at the empty jar with mixed feelings in his heart. In the middle of this brotherly atmosphere, Xiao Yuhong, who had been acting like a backdrop up till now, pointed at the bowl of shredded beef and mumbled, "Brothers, if you're not going to eat, this little brother is going to eat it all." Right after he finished speaking, everyone's chopsticks shot towards the bowl. Now that everyone had joined the fray, the bowl was quickly emptied. When there was only a thin layer of beef left, Captain Guo glared at Changdi and said, "What are you still eating for? Your wife made this, so you must have eaten tons of this before. And yet you still have the face to keep fighting with us. This time, Changdi was much more thick-skinned. He scooped up another piece with his chopsticks and, with nary a change in his expression, he said in a low voice, I left my home just a few days after getting married. This is my first time eating my wife's cooking, so why can't I eat more of it? Zhang Mai patted Changdi's shoulder and burst out into loud laughter. Well, look who's become a miser now. That small bowl of shredded beef wasn't enough when shared between 4 people. When the bowl was finally empty, none of them was satisfied. In the end, Xiao Yuhong poured the remaining scraps and oil into his own bowl to mix in with the porridge and fill his stomach. After that meal, Xiao Yuhong stuck close to Changdi. Brother when is sister-in-law going to send more things over? Changdi's gaze was solidly stuck to the ground. He was truly beginning to regret giving them that taste of beef. Since the beef was so precious to him, he had only eaten small bits of it each time he had taken it out. If he had known that this day would come, he would have definitely eaten his fill and saved himself from heartbreak. However, he hadn't revealed all his cards. He hadn't taken out the beef and pork jerky that Chu Lian had sent him along with the shredded beef. When he heard this brat Xiao Yuhong asking for more, Changdi looked up and stared coldly at him, thinking in his heart, my wife didn't cook this for a stinky man like you. Dream on. Xiao Yuhong awkwardly rubbed his nose. He was inwardly bubbling with frustration. Brother he seemed easy to get along with normally, so why was he being so stingy now? Xiao Yuhong was determined, in the future, he definitely had to marry a wife from Haosing who could cook well. When they finished their meal, the group began to idly chat. Due to this sudden event, they had become much closer when compared to before. As they were speaking, there was a sudden burst of commotion from the outside of their small tent. Chapter 185, Lucky Star, 1. This chapter has been stolen from LoveLore novels. Please read from the original source. Help, someone fainted. Get the doctor. They weren't too far from the tent where the incident had happened, so Captain Guo led Changdi and the others to the area. After they finally managed to squeeze past the crowd, Captain Guo squatted down by one of the unconscious soldiers and sternly asked, what happened here? Replying to Captain, Xiao Qi seems to be having a bad fever. Captain Guo reached out to touch the forehead of the soldier, and it was indeed feverish to the touch. The soldier seemed dazed from the fever, he started to rave like a madman. The crowd waited for a moment, but the doctor still hadn't arrived. Captain Guo's brows furrowed tightly together. He was about to shout the order again when the soldier who had gone off to get the doctor returned in a panic. Without wasting any more time, the soldier said, Captain, the doctor already departed for the left wing, he's not in camp right now. What? Captain Guo punched the ground in frustration, causing a dull thud to ring out from the muddy earth. Captain Guo was part of the army's right wing, and though the majority of the right wing were members of the cavalry, he was a member of the vanguard. Out here in the border camps, he was at loggerheads with Captain Gao Jiangwei of the army's left wing. Changdi saw that the soldier's face was already flushed red from the fever and couldn't help but notice how pitiful he looked. He stepped forward and said to the angry Captain Guo, Captain, let me take a look. Changdi had read a few medical books before. In his previous life, when he had been wandering across the plains, he had learned some folk remedies from Ma, the barbarian woman. Currently, he had with him some of the commonly used Chinese medicines that Chu Lian had sent over. They could probably be used to ease some of the soldier's pain, at least for now. He knelt by the soldier's side and first checked his pulse before opening his eyelids and checking his tongue. Following that, Changdi pulled a small, finely detailed pouch out of his clothes. He took out a honey-colored pill and fed it to the soldier, but the soldier's mouth was too dry so he couldn't swallow the pill. Changdi then took out a small gourd from his waist, and when he opened it, a special aroma began to drift out, the dry, sweet smell of alcohol. As the aroma of alcohol filled the air, some of the old alcoholics amongst the troops deeply inhaled, sinking into the thick and sweet smell of the wine. Changdi didn't care about the others' expressions. He only tipped a small mouthful into the soldier's mouth. Next, he quickly stoppered up the gourd and hung it back at his waist. Under the fading light of the setting sun, the soldiers saw Changdi feed the feverish soldier some thick, light purple liquid. The swig of wine was finally able to wash down the pill in the soldier's mouth. After doing all this, Changdi turned to a few soldiers near him and said, "He should be fine now. Take him back to his tent, he should recover after a good night's rest." Captain Guo patted Changdi's shoulder. "I didn't think that Zixiang would know how to diagnose illnesses. That soldier has you to thank for today. However, what wine did you feed him just now? Someone else shouldn't be drinking alcohol." Changdi stood up and made a slight bow to Captain Guo. The soldier just now was merely a bit feverish due to a cold. The pill I gave him was some medicine from a store in the capital. As for the wine, it wasn't a very strong one, just some grape wine that was sent to me. Grape wine had antibacterial properties that could fight the bacteria from the cold. Although Changdi didn't know anything about the science behind it, he had seen an old traveling doctor use it as a remedy in his past life. Thus, he had given the soldier a mouthful of grape wine just as he had seen the doctor do back then. Well. You little brat, you've kept all sorts of good things from us." Before Captain Guo could think of a way to get the grape wine from Changdi, a deep, loud voice boomed, "Grape wine. Who here has the grape wine? Hand it over immediately." Captain Guo froze. Upon regaining his senses, he quickly got up to welcome their unexpected guest. "General, what business has brought you here?" The guest was dressed in silver armor. He had a white beard and looked a little skinny, but he was full of vigor from head to toe. His eyes were especially bright and full of life. Chapter 186, Lucky Star, 2. This chapter has been stolen from LoveLore novels. Please read from the original source. The Duke of Lu, Great General Qian, harumphed. "Why? Am I not allowed to be here? Who said there was grape wine here? Bring it out." Captain Guo quickly shot a look at Changdi, who stiffened for a moment before stepping forward. He bowed towards Great General Qian before taking the gourd of wine off his waist and handing it over, though not without some hesitation. Great General Qian didn't really have much that he liked, except for wine. Although the northern border troops were only given rough fare to eat, as the highest-ranking commander there, General Qian was different from the common soldiers. At every meal, he could still afford to have a few cups of wine, though it wasn't the best quality. This old alcoholic Great General Qian was very sensitive to the smell of alcohol. Just now, he had been attracted to this area by that elusive smell of wine in the air, and he had happened to overhear Captain Guo and Changdi's conversation. It was rare to find grape wine in the Great Wu dynasty as they mostly produced sorghum wines. The grape wine of this era was pretty much like what Changdi had seen in his previous life, and most of them were made as medicinal wines. Even in the capital, there were very few people who had the opportunity to taste grape wine before, never mind the folks of this desolate border city. The wine-lover General Qian had seen all sorts of wines in his life, but this was his first time seeing grape wine. He immediately took off the stopper on the gourd and took a sniff right in front of Changdi and the other soldiers. The sweet, crisp smell of the wine tickled Great General Qian's senses. He wasn't in any hurry to taste it, so he closed the gourd again and hung it at his waist. General Qian then pointed at Changdi and turned to Captain Guo to ask, "Who is this child, and when did he enter the army?" Captain Guo hadn't thought that General Qian would ask for personal details about the provider of the wine. After a slight moment of surprised hesitation, he shot a look at He Changdi, indicating that he should introduce himself. He Changdi had been trying to find a chance to meet General Qian for days. He obviously hadn't expected that a small gourd of grape wine would do the trick that easily. When he managed to get over his shock, He Changdi quickly seized his moment and respectfully answered, replying to Great General, "This subordinate is the third son of House Jingyan, He Changdi. It has been more than a month since this subordinate joined the northern border troops, and this subordinate is currently serving as a lieutenant in the right wing." Great General Qian's eyes bulged as he stared at He Changdi in disbelief. Once upon a time, he had taught a few martial arts skills to Prince Jin and a certain brat called He Sanlang, this very same He Sanlang. However, wasn't that brat tall and handsome back then? How did he turn into a bearded ruffian like this? Not that many years had passed, had they? If he remembered correctly, He Sanlang shouldn't be older than 20 this year. Actually, it wasn't strange that General Qian thought this way. People of any era liked to admire beauty. There were even men in the capital who would stick flowers in their hair. Most men would keep their face clean of any facial hair, even when they were well into their 30s. The second master of Housing, Chu Qizheng, was a model example of this. Any bearded man on the street was likely over the age of 50. There really weren't many young men like He Changdi with beards. He Changdi's full beard was covering more than half of his handsome face. No wonder General Qian hadn't been able to recognize him at all. "You brat! Why have you come over here?" General Qian's first reaction was amazement, but he quickly turned stern and dissatisfied. He Changdi was about to reply when General Qian's expression turned serious. He suppressed his anger and said, "Come with me right now." Captain Guo watched as He Changdi's tall and slender silhouette followed behind General Qian as he walked to the main tent of the camp. A long moment passed before the captain finally shifted his gaze away. The corners of Captain Guo's lips curled up. He sighed and said, "That brat's pretty lucky." Zhang Mai gently smiled as he stood beside Captain Guo. "If there's a chance in the future, we really have to meet our brother's wife." He Changdi had been able to get close to Captain Guo as well as meet Great General Qian thanks to two small things that his wife had sent over to him. Those two small things had helped him a lot. That newlywed wife of his was really his lucky star. Chapter 187, Lucky Star, 3. Captain Guo shot a glance at his old comrade and said, "If you really envy him, why don't you take another wife, Mai? It's already been more than 10 years. Originally, Zhang Mai did have a wife. He had been born into a military family, and so when the imperial court had sent out a conscription order, he was forced to abandon his wife of 6 months and leave home, leaving behind both his old father and young wife. Before he left, his wife had just gotten pregnant. He had thought that his wife would give him a son or daughter to pamper. Who could have predicted that his village would get attacked by mountain bandits when his wife was 7 months pregnant? His father had sacrificed his life to protect his wife, but in the end, both of them had perished together with the unborn child in his wife's belly. Before Zhang Mai had left, he had a whole family. Not even a year later, he had no one. It was due to this that he hadn't retired from the army and stayed with the troops, even though he had been wounded. Zhang Mai shook his head and changed the topic. "It looks like that brat hid other good things, too. When I get back to my tent, I have to search harder. There might be something even tastier to eat." Captain Guo could only shake his head helplessly. When Chu Lian returned to the Jingan estate, she went to Qingxi Hall first. Senior servant Lu came out to welcome her. She reported the news of the Wang family's punishment to Chu Lian before leading her into Qingxi Hall to meet Matriarch He. Matriarch He reassured her for a bit before reminding her that she needed to attend the mid-autumn banquet, which was a feast held inside the palace. She had to show her gratitude for the bestowal of the noble title there, too. The matriarch reminded her to prepare for the banquet. The mid-autumn banquet was meant for titled noble madams. It shouldn't have affected Chu Lian at all, and she could have had a nice celebration with the girls in her own courtyard otherwise. However, since she was now 5th-ranked honored Lady Genie, she was no longer able to skip the banquet. Chu Lian took leave of matriarchy and returned to her own courtyard. Senior servants Gue and Zhong had the other servants show her the court dress she was to wear for the mid-autumn banquet. Chu Lian didn't know a single thing about the etiquette and rules for this type of clothing, so she could only tell the senior servants to do as they saw fit. She practiced 2 more pages of calligraphy in her small study before looking over her plan to revitalize Gillen Restaurant once again. She removed the parts that weren't very suitable and added a few more based on what she had seen today. After this bit of business, it was already time for rest. Over the course of the next 2 days, Chu Lian handed over the silver she had saved up and requested the matriarch to find some good workers for her. She needed help to renovate Gillen Restaurant according to her plan. Time flew by too quickly, and in the blink of an eye, it was already the day of the Mid-Autumn Festival. The custom of the Great Wu Dynasty was to eat round cakes today. These were a type of dessert made out of glutinous rice, soft and sticky. When the glutinous rice was cooked, it could be formed into a round shape and rolled in a finishing layer of powder. To get different flavors, they merely rolled the cakes in different powders. The most common flavors were sesame, soybean, and chestnut. They were kind of like mochi in the modern world. It was extremely easy to make them, and the only difference was in the outer layer of powder. When Chu Lian got up, the first thing she saw was senior servant Gue ordering the cooks to make round cakes. Chu Lian couldn't muster up any appetite at all when she looked at these sticky desserts. Instead, she thought back to the mooncakes eaten during the mid-autumn festivals of the modern world. In the end, she couldn't resist the urge and decided to make some. Even if she didn't give them away to others, she could eat them and reminisce about life back in a more modern era. Chapter 188, Venturing into the Palace, 1. This chapter has been stolen from LoveLore novels. Please read from the original source. Upon hearing that third young madam was thinking about a new type of confection, all the handmaids grew excited. They went about making the preparations with wide grins on their faces, clearing out the kitchen in order to make space as well as readying the ingredients for assembly and baking. It wasn't too hard to make mooncakes. As long as they had the right ingredients, it was much simpler than the 8 confections. Since there was a limit to the ingredients they could prepare on such short notice, Chu Lian's mooncake stuffing was limited to egg yolk, ham, bean paste, and pine nuts with jujube paste. She had Xian retrieve the previously prepared molds for the mooncakes. Next, she wrapped the stuffing inside the mooncake skin and carved an auspicious image on top of the soft skin. Finally, they put the mooncakes into the oven to finish them off. It was easy to shape the Cantonese-style mooncakes. After baking, the outer layer of skin was crisp and fluffy with delicate, lovely forms. Since it wasn't one of the Great Wu Dynasty's traditional mid-autumn desserts, Chu Lian didn't make many mooncakes, for fear that they would outshine the round cakes. She didn't send any mooncakes to the other branches of the family either, and only prepared enough for herself to eat in her own courtyard, just to satisfy her cravings. Chu Lian made each mooncake about the size of a lychee, even with the stuffing inside. You could finish one piece in 2 or 3 bites, so it was very convenient. When she was done making mooncakes, Chu Lian changed into her court dress befitting a 5th-ranked honored lady. She let Jingyan dress her up with all the accessories that came in the set. When she was done, senior servant Lu had come over to invite her to the outer court. Before she left, Xian glanced at the mooncakes sitting on a tray on the table and asked, "Third young madam, do you want to bring some mooncakes to eat on the way there?" Senior servant Lu had just told Chu Lian that the entire banquet would probably last until night time, and they would likely return to the estate at a very late hour. She had to bring everything she needed, as the palace wasn't like any other normal estate. There were many rules and inconveniences. After keeping that in consideration, Chu Lian nodded. Bring some. Pack some extra clothes just in case, too. Xian filled up a small exquisite box with a whole plate of mooncakes and took out a pale pinkish-purple colored purse embroidered with autumn lotuses. She then quickly stuffed 3 mooncakes within and shoved it into Chu Lian's hands. As Chu Lian watched Xian's actions, she almost burst out into laughter. Why, are you afraid that your master will starve to death? Xian's face flushed a little. Actually, the blame for Xian's strange habit of bringing Chu Lian snacks laid with Chu Lian herself. It was all thanks to Chu Lian always bringing some snacks along with her whenever she left the estate. It had also been Chu Lian who had ordered the maidservants to make these small purses in the first place. Chu Lian took the purse and even added a few pieces of jerky inside. Senior servant Gue held back the urge to sigh at this. Thinking she might need a reminder, senior servant Gue piped up, "Third young madam, it's getting late, it's about time to leave." By the time they reached the outer court, the steward had already finished preparing the carriages. Matriarch He was already seated in the parlor waiting with her handmaid Muxiang and senior servant Zhou. Seated next to her was Madame Zhou. Madame Zhou hadn't changed into a court dress. The mid-autumn banquet started in the late afternoon, so she would have to wait until then to enter the palace. Matriarch He was accompanying Chu Lian into the palace this early in the afternoon for a few reasons. Firstly, she was afraid that Chu Lian would mess up somehow while giving thanks to the emperor on her first venture into the palace. Secondly, she wanted to take this chance to chat with her old friend, the Empress Dowager. She could also take her youngest granddaughter-in-law to meet the Empress Dowager on the way. When Madame Zhou noticed that Chu Lian had entered the parlor with her servants, she couldn't resist looking this third sister-in-law of hers up and down. Chu Lian was wearing an honored lady's court dress. Although it was just a 5th-ranked title, it was very different from the court dress of a normal noble madam. TL note: the return of food porn. The Great Wu Dynasty's traditional round cakes might look something like these modern round cakes or tuongo. Unfortunately, I'm not too familiar with these, so I can't tell you how they taste. Round cakes. Chu Lian made Cantonese-style mooncakes. These are basically made with lotus or red bean paste and egg yolk, wrapped in a layer of dough and baked until golden brown. Traditional baked mooncakes. She also stuffed some mooncakes with ham, which I didn't know was a thing. OAO mooncakes with ham stuffing. I prefer modern snowskin mooncakes myself. They come in such pretty colors and tasty flavors. Snowskin mooncakes. Chapter 189, Venturing into the Palace, 2. This chapter has been stolen from LoveLore novels. Please read from the original source. The court dresses for the noble madams, from the first rank to the last, were all dark in color. The styles were also passed down from the previous dynasty, very traditional and old. Even a young lady would seem old wearing them. However, the court dresses for female members of the imperial family, which included imperial princesses, royal princesses, feudal princesses, and honored ladies, were always made in the latest styles of the dynasty. The honored lady's court dress had a pale pinkish-purple base and embroidered golden flowers on the collars and sleeves. The main part of the dress was a bright red jacquard weave with peonies sewn on top with golden brocade. Such a fresh, tender color complemented Chu Lian's equally tender age well. A broad sash tied at the waist completed the outfit, making her waist look even more slender than before. One of the jade hair ornaments that the emperor had given her was set on the top of her head. The dignified hairstyle served as the figurative cherry on top. It emphasized her blossoming femininity and discarded the last bits of her childish girliness. Matriarch had obviously been blown away by Chu Lian's get-up today. She nodded inwardly, appreciating the beauty of Sanlang's wife. Beauty is loved by all, and Matriarch wasn't an exception to the rule. She chuckled and waved towards Chu Lian. Sanlang's wife, come over to grandmother's side. Let grandmother take a good look at you. After Chu Lian bowed in greeting to Matriarch and Madame Zhou, she quickly moved over to Matriarch's side. The matriarch looked her over in satisfaction before helping her adjust the jade hairpin on her head that had gone slightly askew. Although there was still a trace of a smile on Madame Zhou's face, her inner heart wasn't at all as peaceful as her expression suggested. She suppressed the anger within and said, "Third sister-in-law, since you're preparing to enter the palace to give thanks today, you should have gotten ready earlier. How could you let grandmother wait in the parlor like this?" Chu Lian was momentarily stunned. She hadn't expected Madame Zhou to make trouble for her right in front of the matriarch. Actually, she wasn't late at all. The matriarch had instructed her to meet at this time in the outer court so they could leave together. Matriarch was older, so it was easier for her to get up in the morning. Thus, she had happened to arrive at the parlor just a moment earlier. The matriarch's outstretched hands that were helping to straighten Chu Lian's hair suddenly froze. Chu Lian sighed in her heart, helpless. If she had known that this would happen, she shouldn't have bothered to interfere when the main kitchen had caught fire. Since she was about to enter the palace, Chu Lian didn't want to cause a ruckus about it now. She turned around and bobbed in Madame Zhou's direction. "Eldest sister-in-law is right. I'll take note of it next time." When Chu Lian had bowed down to her and apologized while dressed as a fifth-ranked honored lady, a perverted sense of satisfaction had suffused within Madame Zhou's heart. She immediately switched to a benevolent expression and personally lifted Chu Lian up from her curtsy. "Third sister-in-law, it wasn't my intention to reprimand you, but grandmother is already at such an age, she can't withstand such trouble. Just take note of it in the future. If not, I won't let it go just like that the next time." Chu Lian's lowered face instantly turned cold. Matriarch had been watching the entire scene with sharp eyes. She blinked and said, "All right, it's time to go. Sanlang's wife, let's leave." Madame Zhou watched Chu Lian help Matriarch up the carriage before returning to her own courtyard. The lake blue handkerchief in her hands had already been wrung until it was coming apart at the seams. Chu Lian helped Matriarch off the carriage in front of Zhuke Gate. Following that, they got onto the sedans that the Empress Dowager had sent to them, and they rode these until they reached the south gate of the inner palace. They were invited to disembark from the sedans and led inside by a eunuch. Red roof tiles, painted green walls, grand rafters, carved walls, and glass tiles scattered the afternoon sunbeams, creating a radiant scene that did well to show off the splendor of the great Wu dynasty. Matriarch was about to follow Chu Lian on her way to meet the emperor to give thanks, but was held back by a middle-aged eunuch. "Matriarch, please follow this one to the Empress Dowager's palace. The Empress Dowager has been waiting since morning." TL note, this looks like a good approximation of what Chu Lian is wearing. Please ignore any historical inaccuracies if the style of this dress doesn't match with the time period. Chapter 190, Venturing into the Palace, 3. This chapter has been stolen from LoveLore novels. Please read from the original source. Matriarch sighed. She had expected this to happen, so she had given Chu Lian all the instructions she could in the carriage. Now, she could only pat Chu Lian's small, fair hand in comfort and hope that Chu Lian's heart was big enough to face what was ahead. Since Matriarch couldn't even meet the emperor, servants like Xian and senior servant Gui were held back in a side hall. Only Chu Lian was led by a young inner palace eunuch towards the great palace hall ahead. The golden tiles beneath her feet had been shined until they reflected her image like mirrors. Chu Lian didn't dare to walk too quickly, afraid that she would fall. Thus, this became a long and arduous walk for her. She was about to meet the leader of the entire Great Wu dynasty, the emperor of a whole country who held power over life and death here. She would be lying if she said she wasn't nervous. She hadn't been born in this dynasty, so although she respected the imperial family, she didn't really fear them. "Eunuch's son, where are you taking honored Lady Jeannie?" Suddenly, a thin, clear voice called out from behind them. Chu Lian turned around at the same time as the eunuch guiding her, and was met with the sight of a tall and slender man standing at the top of some white stone stairs. The man's azure eyes were too outstanding, how could she possibly forget them so easily? Eunuch's son bowed towards Prince Jean. Replying to Prince Jean, "This servant is taking honored lady to meet the emperor." Prince Jin's light gaze landed upon Chu Lian. His clearly measuring gaze made Chu Lian feel uncomfortable. "At least you're dressed better today." Chu Lian froze for a bit, her almond-shaped eyes widening in surprise. What? Was Prince Jean criticizing her outfit? When had she become so familiar with Prince Jean? Chu Lian didn't want to get involved with any of the imperial family at all, especially the children of the emperor. They were the center of imperial power. She definitely didn't want to be stuck in between any imperial power struggles. Although she did help him out a bit the last time they met, Chu Lian intended to keep her distance from him, as much as she could. Chu Lian bobbed towards Prince Jean, as thanks for his compliment. "If Prince Jean doesn't have any business with this one will continue guiding honored Lady Jeannie," Eunuch's son said respectfully. Chu Lian was about to turn and leave, when Prince Jean suddenly drew closer and shot Eunuch's son a look. Eunuch's son quickly lowered his head and retreated a few steps, waiting at the side. Prince Jean was about as tall as He Changdi, so when he stood in front of Chu Lian, it was as if there was a huge ominous cloud before her. Prince Jean looked down at her without any sort of expression of his face. Although his tone was calm, his words made Chu Lian stiffen up for a brief moment. "Jeannie, since you helped this prince, you're likely a smart one inside. This prince advises you not to act beyond your means. Even if you have the desire to, you should think twice and measure the consequences in your heart first. Think thrice before you decide to do anything." Chu Lian's slender brows drew together. "Prince Jean, I can't understand what you're saying." "If you don't understand, then think more on it." Prince Jin's light yet murky eyes shot a warning look at Chu Lian. Although Chu Lian didn't show any of her emotions on the surface, she was already hitting her head against a wall on the inside. What was this? What kind of ruthless, preposterous thing had she done to make Prince Jean suspicious of her? Was he going crazy, too? Chu Lian felt that she hadn't done anything harmful since coming to the Great Wu dynasty. However, the fact of the matter was she had just been accused, and by someone like Prince Jean whom she had only met once before. Even the nicest person had a limit to their temper. Chu Lian didn't want to pretend to be polite to Prince Jean any longer. Her cheeks were puffed up as she glared at him. "I'll think over Prince Jin's words carefully when I get home. There's no need for Prince Jean to trouble yourself over me." When she was done, she turned and ran, stunning Prince Jean for a moment. Eunuch's son found the whole situation a little awkward. After bowing in farewell to Prince Jean, he chased after her, shouting, "Honored lady, please walk a little slower. That's the wrong way, the hall isn't that way." Chu Lian could only turn to run in the right direction, however, who could have expected the floor to be so slippery? She was moving too fast, and the court dress had way too many layers. She accidentally stepped on the hem of her dress and fell to the floor. Chapter 191, Meeting the Emperor, 1. This chapter has been stolen from LoveLore Novels. Please read from the original source. By the time Chu Lian had awkwardly gotten up from the floor with the help of Eunuch Sun, she glanced back and saw that Prince Jean was still standing at the top of the stairs. His azure eyes were definitely pointed in her direction. Strangely, Chu Lian got the feeling that there was a trace of humor in those unusual eyes of his, almost like he was laughing at her. After she finished straightening out her clothes, Chu Lian stomped her foot in frustration. She didn't dare to turn back around anymore, afraid that she would fall down again. This time, she obediently followed behind Eunuch Sun, carefully watching her steps. Prince Jean turned around, and at an angle that Chu Lian couldn't see, the corners of his lips hooked up into a slight smile. Now that he had seen more of Chu Lian's personality, he couldn't quite believe that she would arrange a secret meeting with Xiao Bojian. Perhaps his good friend He Sanlang had misunderstood her. Eunuch Sun brought Chu Lian inside the Imperial Gardens to Tingyu Pavilion. He announced, "Your Majesty, honored Lady Jeannie has arrived." After that report, he retreated to one side, revealing Chu Lian behind him. Chu Lian lowered her gaze and kneeled down to greet this Qingping Emperor. "Chu Lian pays respects to your Majesty." Suddenly, bell-like laughter rang out. "Your Majesty, this new honored Lady Jeannie that you've named is quite the well-mannered young lady." The Qingping Emperor above her laughed along with her. His voice was low and magnetic, imposing through sound alone. Chu Lian listened as the Qingping Emperor said, "All right, Imperial concubine, don't tease the girl." Chu Lian's head was still lowered, but a glint flashed through her eyes. Imperial concubine. Imperial concubine Wei. Her face contorted into an expression full of suffering. The more she didn't want it, the more likely it was to happen, wasn't it? She had gone against Imperial Princess Liao before. Now the moment she entered the palace, she was faced with Imperial Princess Liao's mother, Imperial concubine Wei. Were the heavens toying with her? "Rise, and let me take a look at you." The Qingping Emperor seemed to be in a good mood today, so his tone was rather carefree. Chu Lian stood and slowly looked up. She sneaked a glance at the two people seated above her. The Qingping Emperor was dressed in imperial yellow. Although he was already middle-aged, he hadn't lost his figure. His eyes were deep and unreadable. The beautiful woman next to him, dressed in an elaborate purple court dress, looked to be in her 20s. She had a tall and slender figure. Her dress was tied right below her bust, emphasizing the fullness of her bosom. She radiated an aura full of pride and strength. Her makeup only added to her charm, with lips painted bright and red. She was just as equally a temptation as she was untouchable by mortal men. This was the Emperor's most favored concubine at the moment, Imperial concubine Wei. The cat-like shape of her eyes made it seem as if she was peering down at Chu Lian from the corner of her eyes. Chu Lian had only taken a quick peek at these two great personages before looking down again. Since she had moved too quickly, she hadn't been able to get a clear view of their expressions. When the Qingping Emperor caught sight of Chu Lian's face, there was a minute shift in his originally calm expression. The deep pools of his eyes flashed for an instant, quickly masking over the change as if he had never been surprised in the first place. Imperial concubine Wei held onto the Qingping Emperor's toned arm, all smiles. She purposefully rubbed her bosom on his arm, smiling tenderly as she said, My, what a surprise. So fertility isn't the only virtue of a lady from Haosing. Look at how beautiful she is. The He family's Sanlang is a lucky one. After saying so, she let out a peal of laughter. Chu Lian frowned, but kept her head lowered. To a bystander, Imperial concubine Wei's words might seem like nothing but a harmless joke. However, Chu Lian could discern the mockery within her words. As a noble lady, who would want their fertility, a matter that was usually kept quiet, to be taken as their main selling point? If not for House Ying's declining status, not a single person in this entire capital would dare to mention such a topic in front of a Chu family lady. The Qingping Emperor kept his stare on the girl before him. Suddenly, his brows drew together. Jeannie, I've heard that you know how to make longevity peach buns that are a little different from the norm. They say your longevity peach buns look like real peaches. Since there's a festival today, why don't you make a plate to add to the festive spirit? Chu Lian hadn't expected such a request from the Qingping Emperor. However, after thinking about it for a bit, it wasn't all that strange. On the day she had visited the Dingyuan estate, that plate of longevity peach buns had given Madame Huang a huge slap on the face and earned the praise of the old Marquis Dingyuan. It had likely spread to all the social circles of the capital by now. Chu Lian agreed to the request without any hesitation. When Eunuch Sun heard this, he quickly stepped forward and asked Chu Lian what ingredients she would need. The Qingping Emperor was momentarily surprised. He hadn't thought that she would agree so quickly. The people of this era guarded their secret recipes with their lives. Getting a secret recipe was akin to getting a huge fortune. Making those longevity peach buns right here in Tingyu Pavilion, in front of a crowd, meant that all the servants here would be able to watch. The secret recipe would definitely be exposed. Did she not care about that one bit? The Qingping Emperor's impression of this magnanimous girl increased favorably. If Chu Lian were to find out that the Qingping Emperor had been using that request to test her personality, she would have definitely rolled her eyes. Even longevity peach buns could be deemed a secret recipe. She was lacking in everything right now, and of them all, the biggest was money. But the one thing Chu Lian did actually have was secret recipes. If the Qingping Emperor wanted 10 secret recipes, she could write them all out for him now without even blinking. TL note, Qingping Emperor is the Emperor's full title, and not his personal name. Chapter 192, Meeting the Emperor, 2. This chapter has been stolen from LoveLore novels. Please read from the original source. Imperial concubine Wei's eyes turned cold. She shot a glance at her handmaid and lightly tapped her seat with a finger. When the handmaid saw that, she lowered her head and snuck out of the area. In a moment, Eunuch Sun had brought over all the ingredients that Chu Lian needed. He placed them on top of a wooden table that had been moved into the room just for this purpose. Next to it was a specially made stove, which the Imperial Palace's unique small steamers could be placed on. A handmaid stood behind Chu Lian, apparently tasked with assisting her. When the Qingping Emperor looked towards the center of the hall, his gaze landed upon the handmaid standing respectfully behind Chu Lian. Imperial concubine, for some reason, I find that handmaid behind Jeannie a little familiar to the eye. Imperial concubine Wei froze for a moment. She hadn't expected the Qingping Emperor to have such a good memory. That handmaid served in her palace. However, her expression didn't change one bit as she explained, that handmaid comes from this concubine's palace. She usually boils some soups for me and she has rather good culinary skills. This concubine was afraid that other maidservants wouldn't put forth their best efforts, so this concubine specially called her here to help Jeannie. The Qingping Emperor needed Imperial concubine Wei's slender hand. How thought of you, my beloved concubine. Jeannie, since Imperial concubine Wei has made such a kind consideration for you, make sure you live up to her expectations. Understood, Your Majesty. Chu Lian started preparing the ingredients before her with an unhurried and calm air. The handmaid also came forth to help her. Although Chu Lian was suspicious that Imperial concubine Wei was going to pull some tricks on her, they were right in front of the Emperor. Imperial concubine Wei wouldn't be able to do much. Thus, Chu Lian took a little more care in preparing each ingredient before her. The corners of Imperial Concubine Wei's lips curled up as she watched the busy Chu Lian bustling about below. Her eye blinked once quickly, and the handmaid helping Chu Lian happened to catch the wink. Imperial Concubine Wei then put on a caring facade as she said, "What a surprise that Jeannie is so familiar with cooking. This concubine heard that you even know how to make quite a few types of confections. Why don't you stay in the imperial kitchens and teach some of your skills to the imperial cooks when you're done here? It can be counted as making a contribution to the imperial family." Without waiting for Chu Lian to reply, a woman's voice sounded from outside the hole. "Imperial Concubine Wei, aren't your words a little inappropriate there? No matter what, Jeannie is a noble lady. She has also been given the title of Honored Lady by His Majesty. By having her stay back to teach the imperial cooks, isn't that an insult to the face of our imperial family?" Imperial Concubine Wei's attention immediately locked onto the woman who walked in, dressed in imperial yellow. Her eyes were lit with a spark of anger. Imperial Concubine Wei sneered as she said, "This sister greets Empress. It's the first time that Empress is meeting Jeannie, but Empress is already speaking up for her. Jeannie will have to properly thank my dear sister Empress later on." Empress Shen's lips twitched upwards in a smile. She first turned to the Qingping Emperor to make her greeting bow. Chu Lian had to stop whatever she was doing and give a proper greeting to the Empress. The smile on the Emperor's face disappeared. "Empress, why have you come here?" "Hearing that your Majesty summoned Jeannie, this humble one wanted to come over to have a look. See, hasn't this humble one arrived right in time? Otherwise, the most exciting part would be over. Since you've come, take a seat." Even though Imperial Concubine Wei was completely unwilling, the Empress ranked higher than her. She had to give up the seat right next to the Emperor and sit below them instead. When the eyes of the two women met, there was an exchange of daggers in their gazes. The Qingping Emperor rubbed at his temples and waved at Chu Lian to continue what she was doing. However, he had already lost his earlier excitement. Imperial Concubine Wei suddenly smiled at Empress Shen with a trace of provocation. Following that, she continued watching Chu Lian. Chu Lian calmed her heart down again. She wasn't too frightened by imperial power in the end. Even though there were three great personages watching her cook, she treated them as normal guests and didn't feel too pressured by them at all. She was serious about everything she did, especially when it came to food. An old woman who had taught her how to cook had once said, "Food tastes best when a serious person cooks it seriously." Thus, she completely immersed herself in the process of cooking with an extremely earnest expression. Someone working hard with all their concentration could always give a favorable impression. The annoyance that had risen in the Emperor's heart thanks to Empress Shen's appearance had been entirely cast away by Chu Lian's seriousness. He watched the hard-working Chu Lian in satisfaction, even admiring her dutifulness a little. When Chu Lian finished preparing the dough, the handmaid had already placed two beautiful, freshly washed peaches right next to Chu Lian for her use. Since she didn't have any peach juice concentrate prepared, Chu Lian could only try to squeeze out the fruit juice herself and mix it into the dough. That way, the freshly steamed longevity peach buns would have the refreshingly sweet flavor of fresh peaches. She picked up a small knife and started to peel off the skin of the peaches, intending to cut them into smaller pieces. When Imperial Concubine Wei noticed Chu Lian's actions, an evil smile appeared on her lips. In the next moment, a girl's shrill scream filled the entire Tingyu pavilion. Chapter 193, Trap 1. This chapter has been stolen from LoveLore novels. Please read from the original source. Chu Lian was still holding a fresh, juicy peach in her left hand and a peeling knife in her right. She pressed her lips together lightly and tilted her head to one side as she looked at the handmaid who had screamed. Her eyes were bright and crystal clear. The handmaid's voice was sharp and thin. In her extreme fright, she had not only cried out once, but even kept screaming after that. When she had tried to retreat, her panic had caused her to step onto the hem of her own dress, leaving her a pathetic heap on the floor. Instantly, Tingyu Pavilion was as silent as a cemetery. When the handmaid recovered her wits and looked around her, she immediately turned pale. In the next second, she scrambled up to kneel on the floor and continuously kowtowed to the three great personages before her, pleading for mercy. This servant deserves to die. This servant deserves to die for losing composure in front of your majesties. Please have mercy, your majesties. Chu Lian's gaze swept towards the pleading handmaid, whose body was practically stuck to the ground. A trace of coldness flashed across her almond-shaped eyes. Then, she placed both the peach and the knife back onto the table. The shrewish scream had sounded like a banshee's cry. Chu Lian cast her gaze downwards and stood to one side. If she hadn't reacted in time, and if she hadn't had experience and guts much stronger from the girls of this era, she would have been the one who screamed instead. The one trembling and begging for mercy on the floor in front of the emperor would be her. The Qingping emperor's previously uplifted mood took a plunge, thanks to that sharp, girlish scream. His expression was stern and dark. The pressure of a long-standing ruler made even Empress Shen and imperial concubine Wei feel like cowering. The Qingping emperor's gaze landed upon imperial concubine Wei. Concubine, is this how a handmaid from your palace behaves? Imperial concubine Wei's expression changed instantly. She caught the smug smile of Empress Shen from the corner of her eyes, and immediately felt the urge to kill this stupid servant. She had simply instructed her to make a little bit of trouble for honored Lady Jeannie. Well, Jeannie was still standing there perfectly fine. However, that stupid bitch had dragged herself into a hole, and she had even dragged her master with her. Imperial concubine Wei grit her teeth and pulled out a smile to face the Qingping emperor with. Your Majesty, please calm down. It was this concubine's failure to teach this servant that caused your Majesty to suffer such a fright. She deserves to be severely punished. After Imperial concubine Wei finished speaking, she waved her wide sleeves and summoned two tall eunuchs into the hall. The two eunuchs grabbed hold of the handmaid's arms and were about to stuff her mouth shut, intending to drag her out to be executed. This handmaid had served Imperial concubine Wei for quite a few years, so she knew the concubine's temper well. She knew that if she were dragged out right now, there was only one fate that awaited her, death. Thus, the handmaid struggled with all her might. Perhaps her strong will to live had brought out her latent power. The weak handmaid actually managed to push the two tall eunuchs aside. This handmaid still had some wits about her. She knew that it would be useless to plead with Imperial concubine Wei now. She stumbled forward a few steps and knelt before the Emperor and Empress, words pouring out from her mouth as she half-sobbed, "Please spare my life, your Majesties. This servant didn't do it on purpose. It was all the honored lady. It was the honored lady. If it hadn't been for the honored lady, this servant wouldn't have lost composure in front of your Majesties and let your Majesties suffer such a fright." When the handmaid had broken out of the eunuch's hold, Imperial concubine Wei had continued shooting looks at the eunuchs. However, they were still too late. The handmaid had already spilled out what she wanted to say. Imperial concubine Wei was extremely frustrated. Her gaze was icy cold, and she looked upon that handmaid as if she was instead a convict on death row rather than a loyal servant. It was rare for Empress Shen to get such a great chance to knock Imperial concubine Wei down a few pegs in front of the Emperor. How could she possibly let this opportunity go? She purposely raised a brow and asked, "Oh. So there's something else to this matter. Emperor, since there is some other reason behind her actions, we have to investigate this matter fully. Otherwise, there will be injustice in our imperial palace." The Qingping Emperor rubbed his temples and waved at Empress Shen, giving her the go-ahead. With one look from Empress Shin, the eunuchs who were about to grab hold of the handmaid again retreated. Imperial concubine Wei's hands turned into fists under her wide sleeves. She was so angry that she almost pierced her palms with her nails. She stared at the kneeling figure below her, eyes as cold as a tundra. Even though the handmaid had gotten a chance to explain herself from Empress Shin, she still didn't dare to drag Imperial concubine Wei down with her. Otherwise, if she somehow managed to walk out of Tingyu Pavilion alive today, she would definitely die in several hundred other ways. Empress Shin gazed down at the handmaid who had broken custom in front of the emperor, her stare heavy with the weight of her imperial might. You just said that it was all because of honored Lady Jeannie. Tell me exactly what happened, truthfully. Malice flashed through the handmaid's lowered eyes. With all the great personages gathered here in this Tingyu Pavilion, as a lowly handmaid, the only one she could attack was that measly honored lady. She took a few deep breaths and tried her best to calm her tone down. Replying to your majesty, this servant was just assisting honored Lady Jeannie, but a huge black worm suddenly landed on this servant's hand. This servant suffered a fright, so, this servant couldn't help but scream. Empress Shin's expression darkened. How could there possibly be worms before us? Are you lying to me? When Empress Shin finished speaking, her gaze shifted to Chu Lian's face, only to realize that House Jing'an's third young madam was expressionless and calm. It was as if this whole fiasco had nothing to do with her, and she was only an onlooker. Chapter 194, Trap 2. This chapter has been stolen from LoveLore novels. Please read from the original source. The handmaid kowtowed a few more times, each one making a dull thud when her head hit the floor. How could this servant dare to lie in front of your majesties? That worm came from within the fresh peach. Your majesty, if it seems beyond belief, how about ordering someone to check the peach? Empress Shin shot a look at a middle-aged eunuch waiting on the side. In a moment, that middle-aged eunuch picked up the half of the peach that Chu Lian had placed on the table. As expected, he found a large hole where a worm had been near the center of the peach. The eunuch reported his finding, and after a few moments, he found that troublemaking, black, wriggling worm near the table. When the handmaid saw that evidence to her claims had been found, her tense heart relaxed for a moment. She almost collapsed on the ground after losing all the strength in her body. It was the honored lady who tossed that worm onto this servant's hand, causing this servant to lose composure before your majesties. Your majesty, please seek justice for this servant. Chu Lian cast a sideways glance towards the handmaid who had suddenly become the victim. The corners of her lips curved upwards. This silly girl, did she think anyone here was stupid? As expected, Empress Shin had thought further. So what you're trying to say is that honored Lady Jeannie purposely tried to lead you into a trap. You're just a lowly handmaid. What benefit is there for honored Lady Jeannie to harm you? The handmaid who had just found a moment to relax was suddenly plunged back into the depths of despair. Her eyes widened, and she couldn't speak for a long moment. This servant, doesn't know, Chu Lian was supposed to make longevity peach buns for the Qingping Emperor. The ingredients were all prepared by people in the palace. Furthermore, this handmaid was one of Imperial concubine Wei's servants. She had also been the one to wash those peaches before handing them over to Chu Lian. However, a disgusting worm had appeared in those supposedly fresh peaches, and Chu Lian was supposed to prepare the peaches herself. It was clear what had happened. Imperial concubine Wei had tried to quickly get rid of this handmaid earlier, because she didn't want the handmaid to make a mistake and expose everything. Even those with the slightest bit of brains could guess what was going on. However, Empress Shin had stopped her with the intention of trapping Imperial concubine Wei. Now that things had progressed to this step, it was as if Imperial concubine Wei had been slapped in the face by Empress Shin right in front of the Emperor. Her face felt like it was on fire. Without waiting for Empress Xin to speak, the emperor ordered in a low tone. Take her out. Beat her to death. The emperor's words were much more powerful than Empress Xin's or imperial concubine Wei's. Before the handmaid could speak another word, she was immediately taken away by 2 guards dressed in black and dragged out. Next, the Qingping emperor glanced at Chu Lian and how she was standing obediently to one side with her head lowered, merely watching the show. If Chu Lian had raised her head at this moment, she would have been able to see the strange glint in the emperor's eyes. Concubine, you failed to teach your servants properly. When the Mid-Autumn Festival is over, you are grounded in your palace for half a month. The Qingping emperor's tone sent chills down everyone's spine. Imperial concubine Wei looked up at the emperor in disbelief. However, the emperor looked like a cold and unreachable ruler right now, nothing at all like the emperor who had snuggled up with Imperial concubine Wei earlier on the same sofa. Imperial concubine Wei looked at the Qingping emperor with aggrieved eyes, hoping that he would retract his order. However, the emperor had already shifted his gaze away. Empress Xin looked gleeful. Right now, the only one in the palace who could vie with her for status was this imperial concubine Wei. This concubine had used so many little tricks in secret to fight with her. Who would have thought that a small matter like this would make imperial concubine Wei fall from grace? How could Empress Xin not be delighted? Following this line of thought, Empress Xin turned her head to look at Chu Lian, a minuscule hint of a smile on her face. As expected, a dog who would bite wouldn't bark. She had underestimated this honored lady genie. Imperial concubine Wei had no other choice but to accept her punishment. The emperor's gaze swept across the entire Tingyu pavilion before he ordered, "Forget it. I no longer have any interest in this. Genie, go to your grandmother over at the Empress Dowager's palace." Chu Lian respectfully bowed and answered in agreement. However, before the crowd started to leave Tingyu Pavilion, a bell-like voice called out from outside the entrance. "Father, father! Yao has come to greet you." When he heard that voice, the dark clouds in the emperor's expression dissipated a little. He turned to the entrance, and in a short moment, a little girl in a pink court dress came running in like a little butterfly. Following that, she threw herself into the emperor's welcoming embrace. The emperor bent down slightly, his face full of tender love as he patted Imperial Princess Liao's hair gently. He asked her, "Liao, why have you come all the way here?" Imperial Princess Liao coquettishly answered, "Yao missed father, so Yao asked the eunuchs and came over." "Yao hasn't seen father for 2 whole days. Did father miss Yao?" The emperor burst out into laughter, enjoying such a warm exchange with his daughter. "Father misses you too." Imperial Princess Liao let out a bright smile. "Yao knows that father loves Yao the best." The emperor pinched his daughter's cheeks gently. Imperial concubine Wei had been kneeling at the side. When she saw her daughter entering the hall, her expression relaxed and she heaved a sigh of relief in her heart. Imperial Princess Liao looked around Tingyu Pavilion and ran into Imperial concubine Wei's embrace next. "Mother, what's wrong? Why are you kneeling on the floor?" Imperial concubine Wei showed a slightly fatigued smile and combed through Imperial Princess Liao's slightly messy fringe. "Yao, mother made a mistake. Mother has to kneel on the floor in repentance." Imperial Princess Liao's eyes widened and she tried to pull her mother up from the ground. However, Imperial concubine Wei didn't move. Imperial Princess Liao ran up to the emperor and hugged his arm, shaking it. "Father, mother didn't do it on purpose. Could you forgive mother just this once?" The Qingping emperor looked into Imperial Princess Liao's eyes and finally gave in. "All right, get up. If there's a next time, you won't be able to make up for it even if Liao pleads for you again." Delight bloomed on Imperial concubine Wei's face. She quickly said, "This humble one wouldn't dare." there won't be a next time. Empress Shen was about to grind her teeth down from frustration. She couldn't believe that the emperor had completely let go of his anger and pardoned imperial concubine Wei's crime just because of 2 simple sentences from Imperial Princess Liao. You're tuning into the LoveLore Library YouTube channel. We're so grateful for your support, and don't forget to subscribe to join us on this incredible journey through captivating stories. Your generosity through donations truly makes a world of difference, as it's the primary source of revenue that allows me to expand and enhance this channel for you. Thank you from the bottom of my heart for being a part of this adventure.